Welcome, brave souls, to Fear File Chronicles, your one-way ticket to spine-chilling stories and terrifying tales. Tonight, we'll be diving into the darkest corners of the human mind with a story. After the Fall, the complete story. Parts 1 through 10. Penned by the twisted mind of Locked 334. Together, we'll explore the unexplained and face our deepest fears. But before we begin, if you enjoy trembling in terror, be sure to hit that like button, share this video with your fellow fear fanatics, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to click the bell notification so you never miss an eerie episode. Your support truly means the world to us, so feel free to leave a comment below to join the Fear File Chronicles community. Now, without further ado, let's unravel the mysteries of the unknown together as we delve into tonight's fear-inducing story, After the Fall, the complete story. Parts 1 through 10. Dim the lights and prepare yourself for a chilling journey into the Fear File Chronicles. A soft breeze brushed against his face. The August sun still warmed his cheeks. Collin lay amongst the brush of what once was a cornfield, the world around him quiet and peaceful. His mother called his name from the back porch, rousing him from his daydream. He stood up, glancing across the field to see her gesturing for him to return. His feet had to make long strides to avoid the brush, and often he stumbled. His mother's calls grew more urgent, and the tone in her voice made him look up again. He watched as several bright streaks of light tore through the clouds above him. Jolting from his dream, Collin's breath came out in erratic bursts at first, but calmed quickly. It was the same dream, night after night, a relic of the life he once had. He would think back to his family and his tiny, single-wide trailer, placed in an old cornfield in a tiny Alabama town. Even the name of the place was now a ghost to him. All that remained was ash, and names meant little. His hands wiped at the dust on his pale face and slowly rose from his makeshift bed. He knew he was somewhere between Georgia and North Carolina, but that was as accurate a guess as he could make. The world had become so much different after the fall. He collected his things in the olive-drab satchel he had found among the debris of his father's belongings. There was little to save, but he managed to salvage some clothing and canned goods. It took him a long time to leave town, but when he realized that no help was coming, he knew he had to seek it himself. He had learned a lot in the few months he had been alone, being cautious being the most important. Collin stepped out of the gaping hole within the half-broken grocery store he had taken shelter in, just as the sun began to light the sky. The color was distorted to crimson through the haze that remained in the air, but he knew it was dawn. Collin removed his father's survival guide from the pack before slinging it on his back. He had read it multiple times, along with a Bible his grandmother had given him. They were the only two books he had been able to save from his home. For that, he had been lucky. One kept him sane and the other kept him alive. He tried to remember the things his father had taught him and wished he had paid more attention. His feet shuffled through the debris of another tiny town that no longer had a name. It had been weeks since he had seen another person, which at first had frightened him, but now was a relief. When Collin was young, he always thought that most people were good. He had the naive notion that if he truly needed help, he could find it within walking distance. His neighbors had always seemed like nice people. His dream was shattered after the event. It was shocking to learn what lengths people would go to in order to survive. He had witnessed his old bus driver put a bullet in a woman's head for a can of SpaghettiOs. There was no going back after that. He couldn't even remember the last time he had spoken. He let his father's 9mm Beretta do the talking. By the time the sun was directly overhead, he came upon a large sign that read, "Welcome to South Carolina." Collin stood stoic, the words almost alien to him. He had never been this far from home. He had tried to find his aunt in Georgia, but the landmarks had been so distorted from the damage he could not discern his true location. Everything was burnt and broken, even him. He brushed away tears from his eyes as he continued forward into the blank canvas before him, wondering if anything would ever be created here again. Cars lined both lanes of the highway he walked. Bodies lay frozen in time within each seat. The television broadcast had told large cities to evacuate, and they all tried. What the report did not inform them of was the fact that there was nowhere to run to. Collin stopped to examine each vehicle, looking for anything useful. His eyes rested on a small car seat in the back of an SUV. The skeletal remains of a child, still secured tightly inside. His fingers brushed across his face, feeling the scars from his own burns and thinking of his younger brother. He had to shake off his despair. He could not break down in the open. It wasn't safe. Nowhere was. Collin walked through what was probably once a bustling main street, greeted by crumpled buildings at every step. The sun was setting, and he knew he would need shelter. The night brought its own dangers. The more troublesome members of society had taken over the dark. Most had learned that people moved at night to avoid detection and had started hunting in the twilight hours. He made sure not to be their prey, finding shelter in an abandoned gas station. He had always hated the dark, but this was different. Now that the moon no longer guided the night, it was like being plunged into oblivion. His body curled up behind a crumpled countertop, resting his head upon his satchel. Clouds rolled in the distance, tinted purple by the ash of the sky. He could smell the tainted moisture that filtered the air. There was a storm on the horizon, which meant there would be less movement in the night. The raging of Mother Nature used to frighten him as a child, but it was a shield in times like these. Collin knew he would be able to sleep soundly for the first time in over 2 weeks. His lips curled slightly into a smile as lightning split the sky. His eyes fluttered in the darkness, and he was lulled to sleep by the rhythm of thunder. His younger brother Danny pounced on him, reminding him that Saturday morning cartoons were on. Collin rubbed the sleep from his eyes and made his way to the living room. With a click of the remote, he appeased his brother and yawned as he walked to the kitchen. He made them both a bowl of Lucky Charms and sat quietly until his parents woke up. They sat and giggled with each other at the antics on screen until their fun was disrupted by an emergency broadcast. Tornado sirens wailed in the distance, but Collin saw no clouds out the window across from them. The sound startled his mother, and soon both his parents stood beside them, their eyes fixed on the screen. It was their first warning of what was to come. Collin was startled by the sound of rustling within the gas station. He pulled the pistol from his coat and moved around the counter cautiously. The sun had not come up yet, and visibility was poor. His pale blue eyes were even worse for seeing in this darkness, but his ears had become sharp. The sound of cans and bottles being rummaged through were like a beacon he honed in on. When he was sure he knew where the intruder was, he lifted his gun to aim. The sound of the safety releasing caused the figure to pause, dropping their loot. They did not move, and Collin froze as well, unsure if they had a weapon. His body shook as he slowly applied pressure to the trigger.
"Please, if you have a gun, don't shoot,"
a child's voice rang out.
"I am just looking for food, not trying to start any trouble."
A raspy voice replied,
"Is there anyone with you?"
"No, sir, I'm alone."
"Then take what you need and leave. That's your last warning."
Tiny feet shuffled in the darkness, grabbing at unseen things. Sounds traced a path until exiting the store. The steps receded into the distance, then vanished. Even then, sleep did not return. Instead, the man named Collin sat, his grip tight on his weapon, waiting for the light of day. With daylight, he saw the mess left behind. Empty shelves and toppled goods told a tale of desperate searching. He felt a twinge of guilt, but he had seen enough. Children had become lures for traps set by merciless adults. He couldn't afford to fall for such tricks. Once the surroundings were clear, Collin ventured outside. A pistol swung in his hand, scanning the vicinity. He found no trace of the child in the nearby cars or around the small building. His eyes fell on a newspaper stand. The same headline, "The End," stared back at him from dusty pages. He wondered if there were still papers being printed somewhere. He longed for a different story to read. Collin remembered the catastrophe as explained by various sources. Large asteroids had bombarded the Earth, disrupting satellites and causing widespread destruction. These asteroids caused asteroid airbursts, leveling structures and uprooting lives. The resultant chaos and lack of communication had brought civilization to its knees. And the world, as he knew it, had changed irrevocably. A tattered road atlas provided a sense of direction. He avoided large cities and major highways due to the danger they posed. He thought he was somewhere north of Augusta, Georgia, near Clarks Hill, South Carolina. He didn't have any family to return to, or at least none he had found. His only plan was to head north, towards a rumored sanctuary in Canada. He replaced the map and began walking. He missed his stolen bicycle. He thought of his 10th birthday when his father had presented him a 10-speed bike. How he had ridden it into the night until his mother called him in. His growling stomach broke his reminiscence. He reached for a bag of beef jerky, the salty speck of a tear falling on his hand. Teriyaki, his father's favorite. Ahead lay an intersection, usually a point for him to reassess his route. Something felt wrong about this one, though. An unusually large number of abandoned cars filled the crossroads. A blockade was clear, constructed of vehicles including an overturned school bus. Despite the apparent stillness, danger lurked. He took cover, choosing to follow the road from the cover of the trees. His progress was cautious and silent. His heart echoed in his ears, the sound amplifying his sense of danger. He had to continue. The risk of getting lost was far too great. Suddenly, voices floated to his ears. Something was happening just beyond bus, but he couldn't see. Collin got a clearer view from behind a van. 3 men, weapons in hand, were harassing a young boy. The boy's possessions scattered on the ground, his backpack torn open. Collin recognized the voice from the night before. He felt an urge to intervene, but stopped as he noticed the shotgun one of the men held. Each man was armed, 2 with hunting rifles and 1 with a shotgun. His stealthy approach had only been possible because they were distracted. He grappled with his conscience, the child's cries echoing in his ears. Suddenly, one of them aimed a pistol at the back of the boy's head. One of the men yelled,
"What are you doing, Earl?"
He's got nothing we want, and he's going to die out here anyway.
The other answered. Suddenly, Collin was in motion. He rounded the bus, safety off, bullets flying from his pistol. The leader discharged a shot into the air before he fell. The boy lay on the ground, covering his ears, crying. Reality slammed into Collin, his weapon now feeling heavy in his hand. His legs gave way as he crumpled to his knees. He had killed people. The realization was a hammer blow, making it hard for him to breathe. He sat, staring down at his hands and feeling like a monster. Soon his face was soaked by his inability to hold back his despair. The boy slowly crawled over to Collin, placing a hand on top of his knee. Collin jumped, not used to being touched, almost falling back.
Thanks, mister.
The young man said through sobs as he slowly got to his feet. It took a good 15 minutes for Collin to compose himself and get up from the road. He shuffled around the men as the boy searched each one for anything useful. They all looked like the kind of men that would have been buddies with his father. The idea that the world had become so horrible in just a few months was torture, and he had hoped he would not have had to become one of its monsters. Collin grabbed one of the rifles, an extra pistol, and as much ammo as he could carry. He only took 1 can of food and a bottle of water. He left the rest for the kid and began walking north again. The boy followed a few feet behind, and Collin simply ignored him for about a mile. They both walked in silence until his new companion decided to speak. He repeated how thankful he was for help and came closer to Collin. When the boy was walking beside him, he noticed a small hand reach over, as if wanting to give him a handshake.
My name's Anthony, but everybody calls me Tony.
He tried to smile through a swollen lip. The older of the two stopped and scratched his head for a moment, and finally took hold of the kid's hand. He shook it gently, not sure how hurt Tony was.
Collin, so are you gonna just keep following me now?
No, as a matter of fact, I was headed this way anyway. You might say that you are following me.
Collin shook his head and started walking again.
Whatever you say, kid.
They continued this way for the next day, mostly silent until Tony decided to spark up a conversation. It was usually silly things that did not matter anymore, like old television programs or comic books. Collin never said much, but did not completely ignore the boy. The way Tony spoke reminded him of his younger brother, and something about that was comforting. The two finally came upon an old farmhouse tucked back inside the tree line. Collin knew darkness would be upon them soon, so he instructed Tony to follow him to the structure. Collin handed Tony a pistol and made sure he knew how to use it, pointing out the safety switch on the side. He told the boy to wait by a tree nearby until he could search the house. The older of the two disappeared into the dark structure, moving from wall to doorway, with his pistol trained on anything within his immediate view. He remembered the basics of breach and clear tactics, not just from his father, but from so many years playing first-person shooter games. He hoped it was enough to keep himself safe. When each room was found empty, he returned to the front door and whistled for Tony to come inside. They made themselves at home within the living room. They were lucky enough to find a small kerosene lamp to fight back the night. Tony attempted to entertain Collin with horrible knock-knock jokes as they passed a can of Franks and beans across the small wooden coffee table. The scene almost felt normal to Collin, and he started to forget what the world had become around him. But with every sound from outside the door, his eyes would jerk toward the window. Each time he would search the surrounding area before coming back inside, and eventually the routine had become exhausting. He just wanted to get some sleep before they had to start walking again in the morning.
Enough jokes. Let's get some rest.
His voice being much harsher than he intended. Tony's head lowered before he slid back to the couch.
Sorry, just used to talking with my brothers before bed.
Collin felt like a jackass and shook his head.
No, I'm sorry, kid. I forget I'm not the only person to lose people. I should remember that,
he said before taking a seat across from his companion.
I don't understand why you keep calling me a kid. You don't look much older than me.
Tony was right. Collin was only 16 when the event occurred. He sat quietly for a moment, thinking about this. He had felt so old lately. He did not want to admit he had no real idea what he was doing, but he was afraid to stop. There had to be something better than what he had come to know, and he had to find it. Tony turned and noticed the fear in Collin's eyes, which made him uneasy. The boy spoke to break the tension.
So, how old are you anyway?
How old are you?
Collin said as he snapped back to reality.
I asked first,
Tony said, sticking out his tongue in mockery.
I'm older, so that trumps who asked first.
Fine, I'm 10. Well, what month is it?
Collin pondered for a moment.
Should be November.
Then I'm 11 this month.
Tony beamed.
What day is your birthday?
The 29th.
Same day as mine.
Collin laughed slightly under his breath, which was the first time he had done that since before the fall. They both joked about sharing a birthday party and baking a cake. Of course, Collin knew this was all fantasy, and probably would never happen. He knew that either of them could be dead at any moment, but he did not want to crush the boy's dream.
I will be 17 this month.
He finally answered the boy's question. Collin dreamed of January. His family huddled around the tiny kitchen table. His younger brother sat in front of a large chocolate cake adorned with 12 lit candles. They sang happy birthday, and their mother told Danny to make a wish. The young man's eyes glowed with excitement. He took in a deep breath and extinguished all the candles but one. The remaining candle made Danny frown. Collin leaned over and put it out with a huff.
I didn't see it still lit. You got 'em all,
he said with a chuckle. He was startled from his dream by the sound of an engine roaring to life. He shot up from the couch. Tony was no longer inside. He grabbed his pistol and rushed outside. A rusty old Chevy truck plowed through the field in front of him. Tony sat bouncing in the driver's seat with a grin from ear to ear. Collin bolted from the front steps, bounding across the field. He yelled for the boy to stop. His calls could not be heard over the truck. He finally came across the path and waved for Tony to stop. Tony's eyes shot open wide as he slammed on the brakes. The truck came to a stop, kicking up dust just a foot from Collin. He rushed to the driver's side, turned off the engine, and yanked Tony out.
What in the hell do you think you are doing?
Tony's eyes welled up.
Just wanted to have a little fun. At this rate, I'm never going to get to drive a car, and I don't know why you don't. It would be a lot better than walking everywhere.
Listen, I didn't get to practice enough before all this shit happened. Plus, don't you think all that racket is bound to draw some attention?
His words were stopped in his throat by the sound of another truck. Collin had been right, and someone now knew where they were. He quickly jerked Tony up and began running for the house. Within moments, the door shut behind them and they tossed their things into their bags. Collin peered out the window. A huge four-wheel drive had stopped outside the farmhouse. There were 2 men inside and 2 more, standing in the bed of it, holding rifles. They all climbed down and began calling for the 2 to come out. They had already been spotted, and now they were trapped inside. Collin whispered for the boy to follow him upstairs. They crept slowly up the wood planks. They made their way to a bedroom that overlooked the men. Then Collin instructed Tony to go to the side window and open it. As the boy did this, Collin brought his rifle up to aim. He peered down the scope and dropped the reticle at about neck level of one of the gunmen. Collin told Tony to let off a few rounds as soon as he took his shot. He squeezed the trigger slowly, remembering to exhale as he drew it all the way back. The crack of the rifle caused Tony to jump. His finger jammed down on the trigger of the pistol again and again. The first man fell to the ground, blood spurting from the side of his neck. The other men scattered at the repeated popping of the pistol. They attempted to seek cover behind their truck, but Collin was already trained in on the next one. The bolt dropped the next round in place, and he fired. A round went through the next one's chest. Another round chambered and fired within seconds, shattering the driver's knee as he tried to run. The last had made a dash across the field, but Collin's last round buried deep in the back of his skull before passing through the other side. When he lowered the rifle, Tony was still clicking away at the pistol. He had no ammo left in the clip. Collin took the pistol from Tony's hands. He shoved it back in the holster he had stolen. He guided the boy downstairs. They exited the front door to see that the driver was still trying to crawl for his truck. Tony was told to remain on the porch as Collin approached the injured man. He stood over him for a moment. The man rolled over to come face to face with Collin's rifle. A final shot rang out in the open field. Then the 2 gathered their belongings and started their trek back to the road in silence. An hour later, Tony attempted to apologize.
I'm sorry.
Collin stopped walking. Without even looking back to the boy, he began yelling,
If you want to survive, you're going to have to listen to what I say and start acting less like a little kid. If you keep running around and joking about this situation, you're going to be dead, Danny.
Then he started walking again, leaving Tony speechless behind him. Tony kept his distance for the rest of the day. They did not even speak during meals or breaks. It was the longest day either of them could remember. By the time they came to rest at a deserted diner, they were simply ready to call it a night. Collin closed his eyes, his pistol resting in his lap. Tony sat across from him, staring at the pistol for a few moments. He had never seen anyone act like Collin did. Questions bubbled up inside him. One question in particular.
You called me Danny.
Collin peeked out to the boy.
What?
Back on the road today, you called me Danny? Who is Danny?
Collin shook his head for a moment.
Don't worry about it.
Tony was afraid to push Collin anymore. He knew it would just make things worse. He shuffled against his backpack and tried to get comfortable as the sun disappeared over the horizon. Collin turned away from the boy. He felt the salty tears form at the corner of his eyes. The 2 of them lay in silence for hours before they could actually fall asleep. When both drifted off to a restless sleep, they dreamed of the same thing. And it wasn't birthday cake or presents. Collin simply nudged the boy awake with his boot and tossed him his backpack. He had already been up for a couple of hours. He had stocked up on what few things were still edible from the diner. They began walking again and found themselves passing through a tiny neighborhood. Each house looked similar, yet minor differences drew their attention. They both quietly admired the change of scenery. It had been all trees for quite some time. Collin's eyes trained on the windows most of all, his rifle in hand. Tony had even kept a pistol in his pocket now, knowing danger could be around any corner. They had both become hardened by this world, even though neither of them were truly ready for it. Then Collin's eyes came to rest on something laying in the grass. It was shiny and new, even though it was more of a purple than the blue one he had. He slowly picked up the bicycle, pressing on the tires to check for air. They were firm, and he knew they could use it to move a little quicker. He waved Tony over and sat on the seat, then gestured for Tony to hop on the back pegs. The two of them began rolling down the hill. The breeze on their faces reminded them of a better time. Collin wanted to yell out with excitement, but he knew it would be a bad idea. When the hill tapered off, the bike came to a stop at a sign that read, 30 miles to Charlotte. Collin's fun had been dampened at the thought. He simply pulled out his map. They would need to turn north to avoid the city. He began plotting a path. Tony slipped off the bike and walked over in front of it. He reached up and pulled the paper down so that Collin could see him.
Do you feel like talking to me now?
The boy said in an almost bashful tone.
Just didn't have anything to say,
Collin replied before pulling his map back up.
You could start by telling me who Danny is.
Collin closed the atlas and shoved it back in his satchel with a sigh. He rubbed at his eyes and tried to think of the right words. He tried not to think about his little brother, but Tony was a constant reminder of his mistakes. He wanted to tell Tony the truth and just get it out. It was the first time he even had someone talk to in months. Collin was simply afraid that Tony might leave and never come back.
He was my little brother, about your age, actually.
He finally let it slip.
Was?
Tony's face wrinkled in confusion for a moment, but soon realized his mistake.
I'm sorry. What happened to him?
He died.
Collin replied before looking at the ground where his foot kicked at the asphalt.
Before or after?
The boy quickly responded.
After.
Was all Collin could say. Tony wanted to ask why. He wanted to hug his new friend and tell him it would be okay. Something in him told him that it wasn't the right time, and he knew it was getting late. So he simply climbed back on the bike and tapped Collin on the shoulder before pointing forward. The bike whipped to the left, putting them on a more northern route. The pedals whirred as they left the tiny neighborhood and their small moment of happiness behind. They disappeared over a hill, clouded in the ashy smoke that brought them back to the world they truly lived in. By the end of the following day, they found themselves rolling down Burke Street in Rhodus, South Carolina. The light was fading, and they decided to take refuge in a small Dollar General store. As usual, Collin swept the property before allowing Tony to come inside. The two of them scoured the aisles for any supplies. Most of the good canned food had been taken, but they were able to find a few bags of dry beans. Collin found a first aid kit, and Tony waved a few flashlights that still worked down the aisle to his friend. This meant they did not have to spend another night in the dark, at least until the batteries ran out. They barricaded themselves in the manager's office and gorged themselves on the snack cakes that had not gone stale. It was the closest to a birthday party they were going to get. But it was just as good as long as they were together. When they emerged in the morning, Collin removed his map and showed Tony the route they would have to take. It would put them crossing a bridge, which he hated to do, but it would save them the hours it would take to go around. They mounted their bicycle and quickly descended on the bridge. Their eyes fell on the crumpled remains of the landing, and what was once a passage across the lake now lay in the water. The two slowly descended to the docks, looking up and down the shore to look for another bridge. Tony hopped off the bike and ran down the shore a bit, pointing toward what appeared to be a dam in the distance. He waved to Collin, drawing his attention to their salvation. A smile grew on Collin's face. He really did not want to have to go back and around the water. The bike began to roll forward as Tony came running back. The two boys met back at a small building up from the landing and decided to make their way toward the dam. A whistling noise caught Collin's attention, and he stopped the bike just as an arrow struck him in his right shoulder. Tony screamed at the sight and started toward him, but Collin yelled for him to run for cover. Tony dove behind a pile of canoes, and Collin began pedaling as fast as he could. His eyes scanned the buildings as he went, and just before he passed beyond a building, another arrow buried into the wall beside him. His body fell from the seat of the bicycle and he began crawling behind a storage container. The two boys were only 10 feet from each other, but without knowing where the shots came from, it might as well have been miles. Tony cried into his hands, trying to be silent because Collin had already taught him how important that was. Collin looked down at the shiny projectile that jutted from his jacket, the red having quickly dyed the cloth around it. He was in immense pain, but he could not let that stop him now. The two of them were still in a lot of danger. Collin tried to peer over the crate, but the roof over him blocked most of his view. He knew the shot must have come from an elevated position, but he could not see any open windows or rooftops. He pointed to Tony, then to his eyes, then back out toward the building across from them. It took the boy a minute to understand, but then he shuffled to the other side of the canoes. Tony inched over one of them and searched the area. An arrow punctured the hull of a nearby boat, which sent Tony diving for the ground. He tried to whisper something, but Collin could not make it out. Then the boy pointed to his eyes, then across the street, and made an arch from his hands that signaled roof. Collin put up his hand, instructed Tony to stay put, then eased around the opposite side of the building. As he approached the opposite corner, he took a quick peek toward the roof. Standing with the bow drawn was a very thin man wearing a hockey mask covered in what appeared to be dried blood. Collin watched the man for a few moments. Seeing that he was still focused on the other side of the building, he moved closer, coming to a small car. He attempted to aim the rifle, but pain pulsed through him when he lifted it. He hoisted the barrel over the trunk of the car with his left arm and tried to steady it as best as he could. His breathing had become erratic, causing the reticle on the scope to jump violently. Collin tried to calm himself. He knew he would only get one shot. The crosshairs swayed from the man's head down to his left arm, which happened to be the one holding the compound bow. His breathing slowed, and when his aim was as steady as he could make it, his finger pulled the trigger. The shot grazed the man's left arm, pieces of his jacket scattering to the wind. He turned and fired an arrow that stuck into the hood of the car in front of Collin. The young man ducked for cover as another arrow was let loose. From the corner of the building, he saw Tony, tears streaming down his face. He had used the shot as a distraction to come help, but Collin was not sure what to do. They both made their way back around the building and moved back further away from their attacker. The building was small and would not hide them for long. The man had them at a disadvantage, and Collin knew this. Plus, he now stood between them and the dam. They would have to eliminate the man, but he was not sure how. As they rounded a side street and attempted to come around to their attacker's left, Collin knelt beside a tree and told Tony to take the rifle. He hesitated, but Collin simply shoved it in the boy's hands. Tony shook his head and tried to hand it back, but Collin resisted.
No, I can't lift it, and if we don't stop this guy, we are dead.
He gasped through his pain.
You have to take the shot, kid.
Tony cried. He had never had to kill anyone and did not want to. Collin could see it in the boy's eyes, and he did not want to have to make this choice. There really was no choice, though, and he began to tell him what to do. He pointed at the bolt, drawing it back and placing a new round in the chamber. He dropped the bolt closed and told him to bring it up to his shoulder. Collin pushed the stock into Tony's shoulder hard.
You've got to have a good grip on this one. It has more kick than the pistol. You're going to want to look through that lens right there, and where the two lines meet is what you are aiming for. You try to calm yourself, line up those crosshairs, then take a deep breath. You pull that trigger as you breathe out slowly, and you will be fine.
The words came rushing back to Collin, just the way they had from his father. Tony crouched and crawled around the tree. He could see the man still searching for them, but only the top half of his body was visible. He rose to his knees, trying to brace himself. Collin stood right behind him, reminding him to try to stay calm. The man turned to look in their direction and came close to that side of the roof. Tony began shaking at his feet, and it traveled through his whole body. Collin rested a hand on his shoulder and promised it would be all right. The crosshairs danced around a bit, and Collin reminded him to shoot for the biggest part of the man's body he could see. When the two lines intersected over the man's stomach, Tony let out a sigh and pulled the trigger. The two found their way to a church nearby and Tony sat on a pew as Collin dropped his bag beside him. He told Tony that he needed him to break the back end of the arrow and pull it out. Tony hesitated, but Collin insisted, handing him a thick towel. He told him to break the end off, remove it and cover the wound with the towel, stressing the fact that he would need to press hard. Tony was still shaking, but he knew his friend was right. He had seen all this in the movies, but he wasn't sure if he was strong enough. The shaft cracked and broke free, causing Collin to scream out in agony. They both removed the halves of the arrow and covered each side with a towel.
What happened to Danny, Collin?
Tony's voice was low, his hope dwindling.
I told you, he died.
But how, Collin? How did he die?
Tony pushed harder for the answer. Collin couldn't take it anymore. He had almost gotten both of them killed, and now he couldn't even lift his rifle. His body jerked from his sobs, unable to hold back anymore. Tony immediately felt horrible for even asking, but was not sure what to say. He simply kept pressing the towel against Collin's shoulder, which was soaked with blood by now.
Collin
paused, the words not wanting to come.
I couldn't protect him.
Tony listened as a story was told about two young boys playing in an old cornfield. The land had long been without a harvest, his family no longer sowing the seeds. It had been a dream of his grandfather's, and once he was gone, no one saw the need. His parents placed their little mobile home on the land to keep his grandmother company. She enjoyed having her grandchildren so close. The boys would spend their evenings and weekends playing in the field and down in the trees behind it. That was until the fall. His parents had died trying to protect them. They did not have a shelter, but all huddled in the center bathroom of his grandmother's two-story house. The two boys had been placed inside a large cast-iron tub, and both parents had lain down on top of them. This was the best shield they had as the heavens rained down on them. When the commotion ended, Collin had to force his parents off of himself and his brother. The medicine cabinet had come crashing down with such force, it had jabbed into their father's skull, and shards of glass protruded from their mother's neck. Danny cried relentlessly as Collin searched for their grandmother. She had lost hope, and they found her body lying outside, still clutching a picture of her late husband. The weeks that followed, Collin could not grieve his parents. He had to be strong for his brother. He dragged him along while collecting things they would need to travel. His first plan was to make his way to his other grandparents' house, which was in a town nearby. It would be a long walk, but he had no choice. There was nowhere else to go. He had already tried 2 neighbors' homes, but they had all attempted to flee. Their cars sat lifeless a few miles down the road. He shielded Danny's eyes as they passed. They came to the yard of their bus driver, who had his shotgun in hand. A young woman clutched a can of soup and begged for help. Collin pulled Danny away as the gun fired and the woman fell to the ground. That was the last time he approached people. Their father taught them to move at night. That way you were less likely to be seen. That might have worked during combat situations, but this was a different world. It was only a week into the 2 boys being alone when the bandits found them. A group of middle-aged men and women had been searching for food and weapons. They took Danny first, and Collin drew his father's pistol. It vibrated in his hands. He'd never had to use it outside target practice, and he was not sure if he could kill someone. He aimed it and ordered them to let Danny go, but they refused. Before he could react, they tossed his screaming little brother in the back seat of a car and sped off. The shots of the pistol pelted the back of the vehicle, but it was no use. Danny was gone.
So, you see,
Collin looked back to Tony with tears in his eyes.
I couldn't protect him. I can't protect you. And I obviously can't save myself.
Tony hugged his friend as best as he could without releasing pressure on the towel.
It's not your fault, Collin. We're just kids. You did the best you could. Hell, you've saved me twice already.
Yeah, but that doesn't bring Danny back.
Well, you said they took him. How do you know he's dead?
You know firsthand what happens to kids that have no use in this world.
He replied with a cold stare, and Tony knew it was true. They both sat quietly. Collin cried himself to sleep, and Tony sat up, watching over him for hours. Over the next month, Collin made it his mission to teach Tony everything he knew. They both read from the survival guide and the Bible at night. They even found a small home library that offered more information on foraging and handcrafted items. Tony even picked out a few books for entertainment value, but Collin was firm on training each day. While Collin healed, Tony became more adept at the world they now lived in. And soon, Collin felt safe with him by his side. They could protect one another, like brothers should, which always made Collin a little sad. Winter was what they were not prepared for. Neither of them came from places that received much snow. By late December, the ground had been coated in white. The two boys found themselves making more frequent stops to rest. Their clothing was not adequate for this type of weather. Collin constantly cursed himself for not being prepared for this. Tony always tried to be his ray of hope. He assured Collin they would find better attire before it got too bad. Collin tried his best to believe his friend. But as the weeks passed, that small sliver of hope began to fade. They had been making poor time already. When they finally reached what should have been the northern portion of Ohio, they knew their map would be almost useless. The rising waters of the Great Lakes had engulfed most of Michigan. This turned the state line into a snow-coated beachside. They had been moving more west to avoid Columbus. Now, they had no choice but to continue in that direction and across Indiana. They had abandoned the bicycle long ago. The snow had risen too high to push through with the tires. Collin stopped at a sign that read, Keeshawau Country Cabins. His eyes were intent on the words. His will was spent, as was his body. Tony tapped him on the shoulder and asked what was wrong. But Collin simply stared at the sign. The wind stung his face. He could no longer feel his toes. They had spent almost 2 months walking through this. Now, they had only made it to Illinois. Collin knew that if they had to avoid major cities and the rising waters from the lakes, it would take them another few months before they reached Canada. He began to regret coming north. He started wishing he had just stayed home and tried to survive there.
Are you okay, man?
Tony nudged him again. Collin remembered why he kept going.
I'm cold and I'm tired.
No shit, so am I.
I think we should find one of these cabins, get a fire going, and hunker down. I don't think we can survive out here much longer.
Collin replied, barely taking notice of Tony's remark. Tony's eyes lit up at the thought of being warm for a while. He took off toward one of the log structures that remained at the camping ground. After a few attempts of finding an unlocked door and failing, Collin simply kicked the door in. They would have to board it shut, but at least they were inside. Tony rushed over to the fireplace. Seeing that whoever had stocked the cabin left enough wood to get it going, he began lighting kindling and grabbed for the first log. Collin surveyed the place. They had abandoned their normal caution for warmth, and he needed to make sure they were safe. The tiny cabin had a living room, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and 1 bathroom. Even if the facility was on a well, Collin knew the pipes would have frozen long ago. They would have to melt down snow over the fire to drink and bathe. The fridge was empty, but there were a few canned goods left in the small pantry. It wasn't much, but it was something. Tony yelled for Collin, letting him know the fire was ready. Collin grabbed a couple of blankets from the bedroom before joining his friend. They both stripped off their dripping coats, shoes, and socks. Then they laid in front of the fire as the sun went down. Tony asked what Collin's plan was from here, but he was silent for a moment.
Let's worry about that in the morning.
He finally replied before tossing Tony a thick comforter. Collin dreamt of lying in the old cornfield again, but this time Danny was right beside him. He turned, staring into his brother's eyes, and noticed malice within them. Danny asked why he had been forgotten so easily. Collin tried to explain through tears. He tried to tell him how sorry he was, and that Tony wasn't a replacement, that he could never replace him. The sky above turned dark and cold, the wind picking up rapidly. Collin looked up as snow began to cover his face. When he looked back, Danny's form was replaced with Tony's. His friend spoke.
Wake up, Collin.
Tony stood over Collin, shaking him, trying to get him to open his eyes. Collin's eyes remained shut, but he mumbled apologies over and over again. Tony felt his forehead. It was extremely warm, and sweat beaded upon it. The young boy could tell his friend was shaking despite how warm it felt. He knew that Collin must have a fever. The boy dug through their pack for the first aid kit. He found a small packet of aspirin before grabbing a bottle of water. He heaved Collin up from behind and pushed the pills between his friend's lips. His hand shook as he tried to pour the water in and get Collin to swallow, begging him to take the medicine. Through his fever-induced haze, Collin choked down the pills. Tony laid him down again and rushed to find a towel. He knew he had to bring down his temperature. For the next few days, Tony medicated his friend, tried to keep him comfortable, and gave as much water as Collin could swallow. They did not have any antibiotics. Tony could only hope Collin was strong enough to fight off whatever infection afflicted him. The boy was scared, but his friend had prepared him to survive. Tony had learned to shoot, track, hunt, and prepare food, which would come in handy as their stocks were running low. They had not seen many animals, but anything would do. When Collin's fever broke, Tony decided to go out to look for food. They only had a couple of cans of beans left, and he knew that wasn't enough. Collin would need real food once he woke up. Tony had found a winter coat in one of the bedrooms. It was a little big, but it would help keep him warm. He took the pistol, Collin's hunting knife, and the rifle as he set out into the endless mounds of white. The wind was harsh to his cheeks, but he knew he had no choice. Collin awoke 4 hours later, his head pounding as he scanned the room. A small sliver of paper had the words, "Gone hunting," scribbled upon it. This caused him to rush to his feet, knowing Tony should not be out there alone. But as soon as his feet came to the floor, he stumbled in his weakened state. His body crashed into the couch, sending pain throughout him. He screamed in agony, gagging and coughing in an effort to catch his breath. He called out for his friend, but unknown to him, Tony was at least a mile away. Tony sat covered in snow near a small bush. His eyes were trained on the slight movements of what appeared to be a snow rabbit. He had been waiting for hours, and this was his chance to bring home some meat. His finger pulled the trigger and the shot rang out just before the animal dropped over, lifeless. Tony let out a laugh of joy as he ran for his reward, grabbing hold of it and his knife. He quickly skinned and cleaned his kill before burying the unused portion. His feet dragged in the snow to cover up any trace of blood or his tracks as he made his way back to the cabin. When the boy stepped into the cabin, Collin almost tackled him in a hug. Collin was sure he had been hurt or taken while out hunting. He squeezed him so tight that it hurt his chest. Eventually, he had to stop and sit back down. A coughing fit erupted from Collin's chest as Tony set down the rabbit. He ran for the first aid kit, looking for something that would help with a cough. But there was nothing. He returned and asked what he could do to help.
You came back. That's enough.
Collin attempted to smile.
So, you got yourself a rabbit?
Tony grinned.
I got us a rabbit.
Tony had learned a little about cooking from his mom before the world turned to crap. Not necessarily rabbit, but he figured it could not be much different. He diced the meat and scrounged the cabinets for any kind of seasoning. There was a bit of salt, pepper, and maybe a sprinkle or two of basil. It wouldn't be much, but it would add a little flavor to the pot. It boiled over the fire as Tony detailed his hunting trip. Collin smiled as he listened to every detail. He was glad his friend was safe. They shared the meat and broth, the warmth of it easing Collin's throat. It was the first time they felt full in a couple of months. The two of them had not had meat since before the snows. With their bellies full, they huddled by the fire again. Tony pulled out one of the books he had acquired along the way, Alice in Wonderland, and began reading. Collin would normally tell him to brush up on something useful, but he felt the boy had earned something more upbeat. He laid there against the couch until he fell asleep. Tony shook Collin violently.
Wake up, Collin.
Collin groggily responded,
What the hell? What's wrong?
There are wolves outside.
That's not possible. Wolves don't live around here.
Collin responded while trying to go back to sleep. Then he heard a very distinct howl. Collin jolted upright, dashing towards the window. Tony trailed close behind him. In the inky darkness, they discerned 3 pairs of gleaming eyes pacing just beyond the tree line. Lured by the scent of Tony's kill, the wolves had followed it back to their cabin. The wolves inched closer, their noses leading them to the doorstep. Two others prowled around the tiny house, their claws scraping the wooden exterior at random intervals. Collin assumed the scarcity of food was what lured them back to a territory they rarely treaded. With their new discovery of an available meal source, they seemed to have no intentions of retreating. Collin hastily called for his rifle, and Tony promptly handed it over.
How many rounds do we have left?
About 5.
Tony responded, the box rattling in his hands.
Shit, we need to save these. We really didn't need this right now.
Tony apologized quickly, but Collin assured him he wasn't mad. He set the rifle down, instead reaching for his pistol. He knew they had more rounds for the pistol, and if used judiciously, it could suffice. Handing Tony another pistol, he suggested they could split the group if they worked together. Tony made his way to the back door, while Collin firmly gripped the front knob. As the door parted slowly, Collin's pistol steadied for aim. One of the wolves turned out of curiosity, only to be greeted with a 9mm bullet. It yelped and retreated back towards the group while Collin stepped onto the porch. The other 2 wolves had advanced on the house just as Tony emerged from around the corner. Collin fired 3 shots at one wolf, missing the first 2 due to its speed. The third hit its hip, causing it to stumble but not slow down. Tony lined up his shot, releasing 2 rounds. The first bullet pierced the wolf's shoulder, and the second found its mark between its eyes, putting it down. As the last of the pack continued to advance, Collin fired 2 more shots. The wolf lunged at Collin, causing his shots to miss. He struggled to keep the wolf's gnashing teeth at bay, pressing the barrel of the pistol to the beast's ear. With a final squeeze of the trigger, the wolf fell limp on top of him. Tony shoved the creature to the side, extending a helping hand to Collin. Both men cleaned up the bodies and dragged them away. Upon returning to the cabin, Tony asked the question he had been holding back for a week. He wanted to know their next plan of action, as they were nearly out of food and still a long way from Canada. Collin had nearly forgotten his promise to share his plan before Tony had fallen ill. He rubbed his eyes, reevaluating the plans he had made that morning. Given their recent encounter with the wolves and the rising aggression of other predators due to lack of food sources, his previous plan didn't seem as solid.
You ever had coffee?
Collin finally broke the silence.
No, but what's that got to do with anything?
Tony responded, his face scrunched up in confusion.
Good, follow me,
Collin said, his face breaking into a smile. Upon their arrival, he had found a half-empty can of Folgers, which he hadn't considered important until now. He emptied the coffee grains into a rag and tied it closed. He boiled the grains, then strained the liquid through another rag. The result was fairly clean, which he poured into 2 mugs. He sat one mug across from him and gestured for Tony to sit.
Okay, I don't think we should go any further until this snow clears up.
He suggested, sipping the strong brew.
Maybe even wait until spring.
Tony attempted a gulp, gagging at the bitter taste.
Wow, how do you drink this stuff?
You get used to it?
Collin lied. He had always preferred his coffee with ample sugar and cream, but those were luxuries they no longer had.
So, what do you think? Hang out here and wait for warmer weather?
Sounds fine to me, but we're gonna need food.
Tony responded, grimacing after taking another sip from his mug.
I think I might have an idea about that, too.
Collin replied, taking another sip of his coffee.
We still have all these cabins around us, and if there is one rabbit, there is bound to be more. We just have to be more careful next time.
They both agreed to make the campground their home for the winter, and spent the next few days searching each cabin. They managed to stockpile their pantry with a variety of canned beans, fruits, vegetables, and dried goods. Then they took to the woods in search of meat. It took a few weeks to gather a reasonable amount of decent food. They transformed the stand-up shower into a meat locker, insulating the walls and filling the bottom with as much ice as they could find. It wasn't perfect, but with a little salt, their meat would stay fresh between uses. They just needed to keep refreshing the ice and restocking their supplies every few weeks. As the weeks passed, they feasted on several rabbits, squirrels, and random rodents. It wasn't ideal, but it kept them fed. They grew more inventive with their recipes to prevent monotony. During the day, they hunted and set traps for predators. At night, they read from a small library of books they had found in the cabins. Most of their literature comprised of magazines, but anything new was a blessing. Collin even set aside time to teach Tony anything he could remember from high school. They had become a family, with their own home.
You don't talk much about your family.
Collin commented one night after dinner.
You never asked.
The boy replied matter-of-factly.
Well, I am now, so...
Tony paused, his gaze drifting into the distance as he dredged up a past he had nearly forgotten. When memories flooded back, he began to narrate his story, reminiscent of one of their books. Tony had come from a broken home. He had never met his father, and his 3 older brothers were the primary providers. Their mother was a heroin addict, and when he was 9, a social worker arrived to remove him and his brothers from their unstable home. The following years saw them shuffled among foster homes, until the fall, when he was separated from his siblings and left clueless about their whereabouts. Collin was on the verge of tears hearing that Tony had been abandoned the day of the fall. The boy had been huddled alone in their basement while the world crumbled above. Emerging from his refuge, he found his recent home destroyed. His foster parents hadn't even called to inform him they weren't returning. Collin hugged his new friend, which sparked tears in Tony as well. Collin made him a promise that he would never abandon him like that, and Tony reciprocated the promise. As winter receded, giving way to the first hints of spring, Collin felt a reluctant pull against the comfort of their newfound home. Life had become simpler in the harsh bite of winter. A clarity had come that only the fight for survival could bring. His reluctance was palpable. His eyes glazed over in a dreamlike reverie, until Tony broke through the comforting illusion. They both understood they could not remain there indefinitely, particularly now with the protective layer of ice and snow fading, removing their natural refrigeration. Wild game had become scarcer, a likely result of their disturbance of the previously untouched landscape. Preparations to leave their home were inevitable. Their pace had decelerated. The frenetic urgency had been replaced with a tranquil peace. For now, they had each other, and that was sufficient. Their journey to Wisconsin took far longer than it should have. But with the approach of summer and the allure of a substantial lake promised by their map, the delays didn't matter. The concept of a vacation, something so ordinary, yet elusive in Collin's childhood, tempted him now that Tony was by his side. Upon arrival, they settled into a spacious home nestled at the end of what was formerly known as Lewis Street in West Salem, Wisconsin. The backyard presented an expansive view across the serene waters of Lake Neshonoc. Collin remained at the beginning of the dock while Tony explored the end. An abandoned boat, still tethered to a post, bobbed gently on the surface. Tony returned, fishing poles in hand, his face alight with anticipation.
Look at this. We might be able to catch some dinner.
Yeah, maybe.
Collin replied with a warm smile.
Do you know how to fish?
Tony's face faltered.
Not really. My brothers took me once, but that was a long time ago. You can teach me, right?
Collin nodded, taking a fishing pole and following Tony onto the dock. Their fishing adventure was fruitless, the franks from their canned beans proving to be an ineffective bait. Nevertheless, they spent hours at the end of the dock, exchanging stories about their journey and future plans. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they returned home, hopeful they could find better bait hidden somewhere.
If we find nothing else, we can always dig for worms,
suggested Collin. Tony, bubbling with enthusiasm, asked,
Can we try again tonight?
Let's start early in the morning. I'm pretty hungry and we could both use some rest.
Though disappointment flashed across Tony's face, he understood. He began to unpack some canned food for their dinner, while Collin began exploring the house for potential resources, like blankets or fresh clothes. In the living room, Collin found Tony standing over their bags, holding the Bible his grandmother had given him. Tucked between the pages was a small family photograph. Pointing at the picture, Collin identified the faces.
That's my dad, my mom, me. And my brother, Danny.
You guys look happy.
Yeah, we were,
said Collin, taking the picture and staring at the faded image. The photograph transported him back in time to the Sunday morning it was taken. Collin, in his button-down shirt and red sweater vest, Danny looking nearly naval in his attire, and their parents holding them close, broad smiles across their faces. Though he hadn't wanted to take the picture that day, now he would give anything for another day just like it. A tear slipped from his eye as he carefully returned the photo to its place in the Bible. Recognizing Collin's pain, Tony handed him a bowl of beans. The rest of their evening was spent quietly, eating their dinner and making themselves comfortable in the living room. Tony's dreams were filled with the excitement of freshly caught fish, while Collin's mind was haunted by memories of his family and the cataclysmic event that shattered their world. The next morning, Tony woke Collin with a loud proclamation.
It's time to catch some fish.
All right, okay.
Collin muttered sleepily, slipping into his shoes. They found their way to the dock, and under the dim light of the encroaching dawn, they began fishing. As Tony dug in the mud for worms, Collin looked up at the hazed sky. It wasn't the bright summer he remembered, but it was something. Their morning was spent fishing and talking, with Tony carrying most of the conversation. That is, until a tug on Tony's line silenced him.
I got one.
Collin abandoned his pole to assist Tony. Together, they reeled in a bass, the largest either of them had ever seen. Tony held the fish up in celebration, causing both of them to break into laughter. Their successful catch promised a decent meal. Under Collin's guidance, Tony learned to descale and prepare the fish. A conveniently located fire pit in their temporary residence allowed them to cook their catch perfectly. As they enjoyed their seafood dinner, they shared more stories.
I caught my first fish when I was 5.
Collin recalled with a chuckle.
I was too scared to touch it when it flopped onto the bank.
Did you eat it?
No, my family wasn't big into seafood. It was more about spending time with my dad.
Tony paused, his gaze lost in the fire.
You talk like you and your dad didn't get along too well?
Collin carefully turned the fish on the spit they'd created.
Well, he was good at teaching me things, but he wasn't so good at showing how he felt. I don't think I ever remember him hugging me or telling me he loved me.
That sucks.
Yeah, I always told myself if I had kids, I would always tell them I love them. I don't think a kid should have to go his whole life not hearing that.
Collin confessed, his gaze still fixed on the fire.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Tony sighed. Collin recognized the sadness in Tony's voice. They had both come from a world starved of love. In the broken world they now inhabited, Collin felt an uncanny sense of gratitude for having found Tony. Despite the smog-filled air and ash that occasionally littered the ground, everything felt more manageable with Tony around. Privately, Collin prayed for the boy's safety, even though he was no longer certain if a benevolent deity was listening. They retired for the night, their bellies full of fresh fish and canned vegetables. While Tony slept, Collin stayed awake, his thoughts consumed by memories of his family. He pondered on Tony's speculative words about Danny possibly still being alive. His faith in the boy's instinctive wisdom made him wonder if his brother might indeed be alive somewhere. What would he say if he saw Danny again? He found a pen and started writing in the blank pages at the end of his Bible. The next morning, Tony watched as Collin tucked his Bible back into his bag.
What were you doing?
Collin deflected the question, implying he was merely checking his supplies. He suggested they take a swim, but Tony hesitated. The day was spent teaching Tony to swim, a rough process involving much splashing and laughter.
Thanks for teaching me to swim.
Tony gasped as he pulled himself from the lake.
No problem. Sorry it was so rough. It's the only way I ever learned.
Collin laughed lightly. Tony wiped the water from his face.
No, it's fine. Seems to be the only way to learn anything anymore. You get tossed into the deep end, and if you come up, you survive.
Collin had no response to that. It was painfully accurate. The whole world was the deep end now, and those left were either strong enough to keep swimming or lucky enough to float. He wondered which category he fell into and looked at Tony, contemplating the same.
Listen.
Collin began in a somber tone.
If something happens to me, remember everything I've taught you and survive, okay?
Tony looked taken aback by Collin's sudden seriousness. His eyes darted, unsure of how to respond when Collin's hands grasped his shoulders.
Promise me?
Collin's voice was grave.
I promise.
The rest of the summer was spent relishing their time by the lake. Collin was certain they had plenty of time to reach Canada before winter set in. By the time they decided to leave, Tony had become proficient at fishing and swimming. They'd even taken the rowboat out a few times to learn to navigate the water. It was an unforgettable summer, surpassing any memory Collin had from his childhood. His only regret was not being able to share it with Danny. By August, they had reached North Dakota. This meant the border was not far away. Open fields, once bountiful with wheat, stretched for miles with only the occasional town speckled in between. Tony would stretch games of tag for hours, the two of them chasing each other across the ancient farmland. For Collin, it almost felt like he was a kid again, and there was no one to tell them when to stop. They hadn't seen another soul in months. The world was effectively theirs. Upon reaching a sign that read Pembina, Collin pulled out his atlas. His finger traced the route they were on and revealed to Tony that they were less than a day away from the border. Tony was ecstatic. He jumped up and down before playfully slapping Collin on the shoulder, shouting, "You're it!" The boy then bolted into a nearby field, its stalks of old wheat swaying rhythmically in the wind. Without a moment's hesitation, Collin shoved the map back into his pack and darted off after Tony.
I'm gonna get you, kid.
He roared, casting aside his typical caution in the face of their impending freedom. They wove through the field, tagging each other back and forth. The tall grass parted with every step. Suddenly, Tony stopped and crouched down, giggling as he watched Collin fly past him. Oblivious. Collin swept the stalks aside, searching for his elusive friend. His hand finally found Tony's shoulder, and he gave him a gentle shove, sending the boy tumbling onto his hands and knees.
You're gonna pay for that?
Tony yelled, grinning. In response, Collin sprinted away from their small patch, frantically seeking a suitable hiding spot. Emerging from the field, he found himself beside a withering tree. After surveying the area, he found it to be the perfect hiding spot. The stillness of the surroundings would make it harder for Tony to find him. He hunkered down behind the small tree, ready for his friend's approach. But that anticipation turned to terror when he felt the cold steel of a rifle barrel against his back.
Stand up,
A gruff man's voice ordered. Slowly rising, Collin raised his hands into the air.
Listen, I don't have much, but you can have it. We're just trying to get to Canada.
Doesn't look like you're gonna make it, kid. Hand me the pack, nice and slow.
With compliance, Collin let the straps slide down his arms, allowing his pack to fall to the ground.
Now, the rifle.
The man demanded, his tone growing severe. Reluctantly, Collin let the gun join the bag on the ground. The man had noticed the pistol in Collin's holster. He was ordered to remove it as well. His captor moved to inspect the bag, nudging it aside with his foot. Eventually, the man stood in front of Collin, instructing him to kneel and place his hands behind his head. Despite his pleas for freedom, the man remained unmoved. Collin quickly deduced that he had been lying in wait for people like him at the border, and a wave of regret washed over him. His lapse in caution had led to this predicament, and it terrified him that Tony was still out there, blissfully unaware of the danger that awaited. The man was ready to fire, but just as his finger rested on the trigger, Tony burst from the field screaming,
I gotcha.
In a flash, the man's barrel swerved towards the younger boy. Driven by instinct, Collin lunged for the gun, yelling,
No, don't.
His efforts redirected the shot, causing it to bury deep within his chest. Almost simultaneously, Tony drew his pistol and fired a shot into the man's head. Both Collin and their attacker fell to the ground in unison. Tony shoved his pistol back into his waistband and rushed to his friend's side. Frantically, he tried to stem the flow of blood gushing from Collin's wound, but to no avail. Gasping for air as blood filled his lungs, Collin struggled to speak.
No, don't talk. I'm gonna take care of you like last time. You're gonna be okay.
Tony said, tears streaming down his face. Despite his friend's insistence, Collin managed to shake his head and force a weak smile.
It's okay, Tony.
Shut up.
Tony retorted, his voice choked with grief. He removed his jacket to apply more pressure to the wound, but it was hopeless. The wound was severe, and both knew it.
Remember, you promised.
Collin whispered weakly, his breaths coming in gurgling gasps.
No, 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 no!
Tony howled in denial.
You promised.
Collin stammered, struggling to breathe.
I know I promised. I will survive.
Tony finally conceded, his voice barely above a whisper. Collin's vision began to blur, but he managed to speak one last time.
I love you, Tony.
I love you too, Collin.
Tony replied, tears flowing freely as he tried to embrace his friend one last time. Slowly, Collin's eyes closed. His mind retreated to a field where corn once grew. He saw himself lying in the sunlight with his brother Danny beside him. In the distance, he heard his mother calling them back home. He rose slowly, smiling and waving at her. Hand in hand with his brother, he started back towards their little trailer. When he turned his eyes to the sky, he saw the light descending again. This time, when it came, he went with it, leaving with his family. Tony took time to bury Collin's body next to the tree. With their hunting knife, he carved Collin's name into the bark, along with a rough estimate of the date. He wanted to ensure his friend was never forgotten because he knew that he would never forget Collin. To him, Collin had been more than a brother. He had been the closest thing Tony had to a father figure. Tony gathered their belongings and set off towards the Canadian border. He wasn't sure what awaited him, but he was determined to keep his promise. He would go on. He would survive no matter what. The thud of combat boots resonated down an expansive corridor, accompanying Tony as armed guards led him into a large concrete structure embedded in a mountainside. Upon his entry into Canada, his weapons had been seized. He had barely stepped a few yards inside the border station, seemingly abandoned at first glance, when he found a dozen rifles pointing his way. After confiscating his belongings, the guards ushered him into a jeep. Blindfolded for what felt like an eternity, he was finally allowed to see the grand entrance of the bunker. His mind reeled, wondering about their plans for him, and he found himself yearning for Collin's protection. Their journey concluded at a massive iron door. One of the men banged on it with his fist, the sound resonating against the surrounding concrete walls. Seconds later, a metallic clatter emanated from the other side, and the door swung open. Another camouflaged figure gestured Tony inside, directing him to a small chair behind a large metal desk. He took a seat, his body quivering with apprehension. Once the door closed and latched, the man across the desk opened a small folder resting before him. The pen clicked, and the folder was flicked open to reveal a form.
Name?
The man asked. Tony flinched at the sudden query.
Tony, I mean...
Full name, please.
The man's tone was laced with irritation.
Anthony James Williams.
Your age?
Came the next question.
12 in November.
He answered while glancing around.
What is this place?
Your questions will be answered in due course. Right now, we need some answers from you.
The man finally made eye contact with Tony.
So, where are you from?
Tony hesitated before finally admitting.
Georgia.
The man scribbled Tony's responses onto the form, quickly filling it with personal details. Seated nervously, Tony tapped his foot on the floor, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, creating a disconcerting rhythm with the interrogative questions. He thought of Collin, wondering how his friend would have reacted. In his mind, he imagined Collin defiantly standing up to the border guards and overpowering them all. He had built an image of Collin as a superhero, which brought a smile to his face. The sound of the folder snapping shut jerked him out of his daydream.
Okay, enough of the boring stuff. Let's get to why you're here.
The man smiled, introducing himself.
This is Forward Base Charlie, and I am Bandit.
Confused, Tony asked,
Your name is Bandit?
Indeed, we have the option to change our names upon joining. You'll find most people have unique names around here. Once you're settled, you can choose one for yourself, but choose wisely, it sticks with you.
Bandit tapped his pen on the folder as he spoke.
So, what is this place?
Tony gestured around.
When civilization collapsed, many were at a loss. Governments crumbled, armies lost their purpose, and some people just lost it.
Bandit's voice carried a note of humor.
This chaos created a void, and we stepped in to fill it.
And who are you exactly?
Well, our leaders are ex-military from all over. They banded together to protect survivors, recruiting anyone fit to serve. That's how I joined. I was just a greenhorn from Oregon with no experience in handling a firearm.
Bandit chuckled.
But who are you?
Sorry. I tend to ramble on. They say I have a big mouth, which is why they've got me doing these interviews with newcomers.
Tony only shook his head, causing Bandit to realize he still hadn't given a clear answer.
Okay. We call ourselves the Apex Predators.
That sounds really lame.
Bandit shrugged.
I didn't choose the name. Some old-timer did. They believed there are two types of people, predators and prey. They wanted us to be the apex of predators. Get it?
Tony rolled his eyes.
Most of the guys I've seen so far are barely older than me. And you're what, 15?
Bandit looked offended.
16, actually.
He then guided Tony out of the cramped room and further along the hallway. They arrived at a large window overlooking a desk. Behind it, shelves of various supplies were presided over by a young Hispanic girl. Bandit slid Tony's folder through a slot near the window. As the girl reviewed it, she and Bandit bantered casually. Tony stood by, taking in their conversation, and learned that the girl was called Pack Rat, an apt moniker for someone overseeing the base's supplies. His eyes surveyed rows of clothing, food rations, weapons, ammunition, and personal hygiene items. Pack Rat finally addressed Tony, asking for his clothing and shoe sizes. Much like Bandit, she jotted down every response in Tony's file. Once she finished, she disappeared amidst the stacks, returning with a heap of clothing that she dropped into the slot. At Bandit's nod, Tony retrieved the items. 3 tan t-shirts, 3 digital camouflage button-down shirts, matching pants, and a pair of black combat boots. Inside the boots, he found rolled-up socks and underwear.
That's all for now, until we gauge your capabilities better.
They proceeded deeper into the compound, passing through a large set of double doors and arriving at a crosswalk in the hallway. Taking a left, they reached another door leading to what Tony could make out as a barracks through the small window. Bunk beds lined the room, with young men dispersed among them, some reading, some playing cards, some sleeping, and some cleaning rifles. The longer Tony observed, the more he noticed the similarity in their ages. Bandit held the door open, gesturing Tony inside.
After you.
Stepping in, Tony could barely see over the pile of clothes. He looked at the boys around him, all of whom had paused to watch him. The room held its breath as Tony's discomfort grew. Bandit introduced Tony before turning to leave, instructing them to show the newbie around. Everyone remained frozen, especially Tony. In this new world, caution was paramount, and Tony felt like he was facing a T-Rex, remaining as still as possible to avoid an attack. He wanted to vanish, to find a hiding spot from the penetrating stares of every boy in the room. Suddenly, a hand patted his shoulder, making him jump. A dark-haired Caucasian boy laughed before removing his hand.
Haha. Sorry about that.
He said between chuckles.
I remember being just as jumpy when I first got here.
Yeah.
Tony forced a laugh. The boy extended his hand.
Name's Duke.
Tony shook the offered hand.
Duke, huh?
Rubbing his close-cropped hair, Duke gave a weak laugh.
Yeah, some of the guys chose it for me. They thought I sounded like one of those Duke boys from that old TV show.
Tony shook his head.
I've never seen it.
Well, you won't get the reference then. Anyway, let me show you around,
Duke said, guiding Tony down the pathway between the rows of beds. Duke wove his way through clusters of people, identifying each by their unique monikers. There was Skinny, a particularly slender Middle Eastern boy. Tets wasn't from Texas, but the name had latched onto him regardless. Hot Rod, Flex, Rabbit, Joker, Fox, Bug, Wolf, and Mac. Shortened from Mac Truck because of his imposing size. All names imprinted with the personalities of their holders. Tony began to perceive the significance of this name-giving tradition. They appeared delighted to shed their old identities, as though they were clambering out of some personal hell. This spurred Tony's thoughts towards his own prospective name. Lost in his musings, he missed several introductions, only snapping out of it as they neared the bathroom. Duke's voice punctured his reverie.
This room houses the showers and toilets. We've got 2 rules. If it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down. We have to conserve water.
Tony chuckled at the quaint phrasing, and Duke added,
Twice weekly showers, Mondays and Thursdays. Again, for water conservation.
Shrugging off his discomfort, Tony responded,
I'm used to showerless days, so that won't bother me.
Yeah, we all had that mindset when we arrived.
Duke's fingers absent-mindedly scratched at his head, his gaze downward.
So, how long did you survive out there?
Tony's eyes unfocused. Memories of the past year and of Collin flooding his mind.
I managed the first month alone after the fall. I had company for the year following. He, just didn't make it here.
A sorrowful shake of Duke's head.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. We nearly made it. Some jerk tried to mug us just outside the border. My friend stopped him, but got shot.
Tony's foot nudged the concrete as he spoke.
That's rough. But you're here now and we look out for one another.
Duke's firm hand clapped on Tony's back, instilling a warmth in him. A small chuckle slipped from his lips at the prospect of safety. With Collin gone, he doubted it would ever return. But the people here seemed decent. Duke led him to an empty bed. Tony stored his clothes in the footlocker and unrolled his bedding, preparing his bed just as Bandit returned.
Lights out. Big day tomorrow, ladies.
Bandit called out, and the room was engulfed in darkness. The next morning, a trumpet's blare disrupted the peaceful sleep of the room. A hulking figure loomed in the doorway, a young man playing the instrument at his side. With the final note fading, the man issued instructions to dress and gather in the training area. Tony scrambled to dress, his eyes anxiously tracking the boys who left through the doors. He didn't want to be left behind, clueless about the training area's location. While Tony wrestled with his bootlaces, Duke stepped in to assist. Once Tony was ready, Duke reassured him he wouldn't be left to fend for himself. Tony thanked him, a pang of sadness echoing in his chest, as Duke's compassion reminded him of Collin. He tried to conceal his emotion, forcing a smile as they departed the barracks. Upon exiting the rear door of the hall, they emerged into a vast open area, encased by towering concrete walls. Tony's eyes scanned the arena in the hazy daybreak, estimating the wall to be at least 20 feet high. The field, the size of a football pitch, was strewn with ropes, ladders, ramps, tires, and metal bars. Recognition dawned on Tony. This was an obstacle course. The boys organized themselves into rows of 6. Tony found a spot next to Duke. Duke pointed towards the man who had woken them, hinting that he was of importance.
For those unacquainted, I'm Sergeant Buzzkill. You will address me as Sir, understood?
A deafening chorus of "Yes, sir" reverberated around the arena. Startled, Tony flinched. Dissatisfied with the response, the sergeant bellowed again.
I'm sorry. I thought I asked you a question.
Tony joined the chorus this time, his voice adding to the resounding,
Yes, sir.
Sergeant Buzzkill's pacing halted as his gaze landed on Tony. His large frame parted the sea of boys, coming to loom over Tony. His intense gaze bore into Tony's, one forged in the fires of combat. He remained silent, seemingly scrutinizing the new recruit. Worry churned within Tony, his mind buzzing with uncertainty. As his eyes darted to Duke, the sergeant roared.
Don't look at him. Look at me.
Tony stiffened, meeting the sergeant's gaze.
Your name, boy?
The sergeant demanded.
It's,
Spit it out.
The sergeant barked.
It's Tony. Sir.
The sergeant smirked.
No. Your real name, boy?
Tony hadn't decided on a name yet, and his mind raced for an answer. The onlookers awaited his response, the sergeant leaning in closer, deriving pleasure from Tony's discomfort. In that moment, Tony yearned for the comfort of the cabin with Collin. He longed for a do-over, a chance to escape the fear that was creeping back. The sergeant's impatient bellow brought him back.
Well, boy, what is it?
On autopilot, Tony responded,
Stone.
Leaning back, the sergeant guffawed.
Stone? More like pebble.
The boys echoed the sergeant's laughter, all but Duke, who was silenced by a raise of the sergeant's hand.
Very well, Stone,
he finally said, making his way back to the front. Duke's elbow nudged Tony, a grin spreading across his face. Now christened Stone, Tony had etched his place within the base. The day commenced with calisthenics, followed by the obstacle course. Tony, initially anxious, found himself maneuvering with ease, owing his physical preparation to the year with Collin. His desire to honor Collin's memory drove him to finish first. His promise to survive echoed in his mind, and a smile found its way to his face.
Why are you smiling, Stone?
I'm alive, sir.
For now, at least.
The sergeant retorted, a somber note in his voice. Tony's smile faded as the rest of the boys finished the course. Exhausted and panting, they begged for respite. Duke congratulated Tony for finishing first, but Tony's smile was forced, unable to forget the sergeant's ominous warning. The illusion of safety, created by the base's walls, was shattered. Tony knew he would have to venture beyond them someday, a fact confirmed by his instructor's grim warning. The young men spent the winter training. Tony found himself outshining most of his squad mates. While most of them had come from backgrounds with survival knowledge, Tony had lived it during his year with Collin. His sergeant soon requested that Tony become their training squad leader, tasked with carrying out their daily routine. When the announcement was made, Tony could feel the daggers dig into him from some of the older boys within the group. He knew his promotion would stir bad feelings, but there was little he could do about it. Tony had made a promise, and he would do whatever it took to survive. After one particularly grueling day of traversing the course through harsh winter conditions, the boys took to their bunks, groaning in pain. When Tony's head hit the pillow, his exhaustion brought him to slumber far quicker than it ever had. The grumbles and complaints around him had become common, but they faded as visions of the warm waters of a lake filtered into his mind. He saw Collin standing on a bank as Tony swam, the summer sun warming their bodies. A smile crept across Tony's lips during his sleep until the sun was eclipsed by darkness. He began to gasp, unable to breathe, and slipped under the water. Tony woke to his blanket being forced down on both sides by multiple boys. He quickly struggled to free himself, but their combined strength was too much to protest. Tony screamed into the sock that had been shoved into his mouth, begging for help. Soon, a flurry of fists buried into his abdomen. He was struck repeatedly for several minutes within the dark room of their barracks. Each of them had blacked out their faces to avoid identification, but it did not matter. Tony knew who was attacking him and why. The commotion stirred Duke from his bed. He scrambled from his bunk and across another. When he reached the group, his body dove shoulder first into one of the boys holding down Tony. Another released his hold on the blanket to face Duke, slinging a fist in that direction. Duke quickly evaded, grasping hold of the arm as it passed and tossed the boy to the side. As Duke tried to right himself from the maneuver, another punch landed firmly on his jaw, sending him to the floor. This left one side of Tony's bed partially free, giving the squad leader the ability to free himself with squirms and kicks until his body slid from his bunk. Duke struggled to his feet, the other boys rounding the bed. Tony dropped his heel into one of their knees, which caused it to buckle. Soon, Duke and Tony were back to back, surrounded by the remaining boys. They both bore their fists and prepared to fight as the ones on the floor regained their stance. Tony landed a right hook in one of the boys' ribs, while Duke's knee buried in one's gut. Their attack left them open, and they soon felt knuckles bury themselves in their faces. They stumbled, but came to rest against each other's backs for support. The two advanced again, ready to strike, but just before they could land a hit, the fluorescent lights flicked to life above them, and their sergeant's voice echoed through the hall.
What in the hell is going on in here?
All of the boys stood like statues, Tony and Duke turning to face their instructor.
Squad Leader Stone.
The sergeant's eyes cutting to Tony. The group looked to Tony, his face bruised from the altercation. It was easy to see what had transpired, and all of them knew the consequences of their actions. Several boys shuffled their feet behind Tony, preparing nervously for their punishment. Tony had no reason to defend them, but he also knew that if they were punished for fighting, then so would he and Duke. It only took him a few seconds to make his decision. He stood at attention, steadying himself, and cleared his throat.
Everything is fine, sir. Just a sparring session.
Tony lied.
Well, it's over now. It's lights out. Clean yourself up and get to bed.
All of the boys quickly made their way back to their bunks. Tony stood at attention until all of his men were back in bed, staring at the sergeant. Buzzkill gave the boy a slight nod, knowing what he had done for his fellow squad mates, before turning and leaving the room. When the lights went out again, Tony slid back into his bed and pulled his blanket up over his aching body. Every muscle screamed at him in pain, but he would not let it show. There were whispers around the room as he closed his eyes and tried to return to his dream, despite how much he hurt. When they were roused by the morning bugle, each boy made their bed, dressed for the day, and stood at attention at the end of their bunk. Tony stood at the end of the aisle, counting them off as each member of his squad took their place. His eyes fell on 6 empty bunks. Tony stared at them, noticing the neatly made beds. His trance was broken by the sound of Sergeant Buzzkill announcing their orders for the day. They would be participating in a live fire exercise, and they were to report to the indoor firing range. Tony turned on his heel and ordered his men to follow him. They marched down the hall, their instructor walking in tandem with Tony.
Permission to speak, sir.
Permission granted.
Where are my men, sir?
They are not your men anymore. We don't need soldiers like that here.
The group entered the indoor range and took a place at each position. Tony knelt and retrieved his issued AR-15, readying it for use. Buzzkill stood at the end of the line, hand resting on a lever. When it was pulled, their targets would drop from the ceiling. They were instructed to ready themselves, release the safety, and prepare to fire. Tony took his stance and adjusted his breathing, his finger preparing to reach for the trigger. Buzzkill dropped the lever, the opening in the ceiling parting, and 6 large figures hanging from ropes with their heads covered in black bags appeared. Tony's eyes shot open at the sight, his hand loosening its grip on the rifle. None of the boys fired a shot, but stared at the targets in front of them with nooses around their necks.
Fire!
Sir?
I said fire!
No, stand down.
Tony replied, looking back to his men.
Excuse me, Stone. What did you just say?
Buzzkill's eyes grew wide, and the veins in his face grew close to bursting. Tony had grown accustomed to firing at training dummies in sandbags. But this felt wrong. Each boy clicked the safety on their rifle, holding it at an angle as they came to attention. Tony followed suit, his face a mirror of his inner conflict. The boys hanging from the ceiling were already dead. He knew this. There was no sense, no honor in defiling their corpses. These boys hadn't deserved this. The squad leader, eyes curled in anger, stared at the instructor.
Stone, you understand that if you and your men don't fire on those targets, you will pay the price?
Yes, sir, I do.
Tony's response echoed through the firing range.
Very well. The rest of you return to your barracks. Stone, come with me.
Buzzkill disarmed Tony as the rest of the squad exited. His heavy hand rested on Tony's shoulder.
Follow me, boy.
Tony's gaze lingered on Duke. A sense of worry etched on his friend's face. He nodded reassuringly, assuring Duke all would be well, even if he didn't believe it himself. Then, led by Buzzkill, he exited through another door and down the hallway. They halted at a door, flanked by 2 armed guards. Buzzkill handed the AR-15 to one of them before the other opened the door. Tony was guided inside by his instructor's firm hand. Inside, he was placed at a small desk, the kind you might see in a classroom. Across the room, Buzzkill sat in one of the many chairs lining the wall. The door swung open again. Uniformed men entered in single file. Each took a seat across the room while Tony watched the sergeant stand, salute, and hold it until each man was seated. These uniforms were more intricate than Tony's, each adorned with a patch signifying they were apex predator forces. When Buzzkill dropped his salute, he called for a folder. One of the guards entered, clutching a file that looked like the one filled with Tony's information. The folder was handed to the man at the front of the line, who began scanning its contents.
So, this is the one you've been bragging about, Sergeant?
The man questioned from the shadows.
Yes, sir. I believe he has what it takes.
The man passed the folder down as he finished reading.
You think, or you know?
I know, sir.
Buzzkill corrected himself. The man stood and approached the light. Under the dim glow, Tony made out his features. A terribly scarred face. One eye glassy and wider than natural. Tony concluded this man must be blind in that eye. His close-cropped hair and build suggested a history of combat.
My name is General Foreman.
His voice was deep, echoing in Tony's ears.
Who are you, kid?
I'm Toe.
Tony almost slipped.
Stone, sir.
The group chuckled.
Stone. You look like a pebble to me.
Tony held back an eye roll at the general's words.
So, you want to be a predator?
Confusion washed over Tony. He'd never expressed any interest in combat.
I just want to survive, sir. I made a promise to survive.
Promise, huh? To who?
The general smirked. Tony's thoughts drifted to Collin.
A friend. And I intend on keeping it, no matter what.
Foreman turned back to the other men, officers by the looks of it. They conversed in hushed tones for several minutes, deliberating a decision that baffled Tony. Each nodded slowly, seemingly casting their votes. Buzzkill looked back at Tony, giving a nod that everything was fine. But Tony's trust wavered. This man had just ordered him to shoot the lifeless body of a boy. His mind raced, wondering what Collin would do. Before he could find an answer, General Foreman towered over him again.
Okay, Private Stone, we are going to see if you have what it takes.
Foreman announced with a smile. The officers left the room just as they had entered. Tony was alone with Sergeant again. The folder was placed on the desk before him as he received a detailed explanation of the next phase of training. He and the other recruits accepted would be taken for further training. Those who didn't make the cut would be assigned other duties. Tony then questioned the fate of the 6 boys who had seemingly been killed. Buzzkill laughed.
They aren't dead, kid. Just relocated. Those bodies belong to enemies who died in combat.
Wait, what?
Tony stammered, struggling to comprehend.
It was a test to see if you would shoot or act on your better instincts.
Buzzkill smirked.
And you passed, kid.
Tony breathed an almost audible sigh of relief, taken aback by this surprising revelation. He had believed himself trapped within a psychopath-laden camp, a place where murder was the main event. He was guided back to the equipment room, with instructions given to Pack Rat to return all his confiscated personal effects. Soon after, she reappeared carrying the olive green pack he'd taken from Collin. Seeing the bag nearly brought a tear to Tony's eye, but he swiftly wiped it away. He accepted his belongings and was led to a part of the compound previously unexplored by him, another barracks filled with young men. His gaze swept over the room, identifying only 2 familiar faces. The rest, he assumed, had been reassigned. A twinge of sadness hit him when Duke was nowhere to be seen, but he held on to the hope that it was for the best. Tony was not even sure if he wanted to be part of this group, but it appeared he had little choice. He only hoped that he'd be safer, surrounded by these soldiers. An older boy, appearing about 17, approached him, his dark, scraggly hair hanging to his shoulders, some of it tied back to keep out of his face. His skin was heavily tanned by the sun. He quickly extended a hand.
The name's Apache.
Tony responded.
I'm Stone.
Welcome to B Company, Stone. Come on, let me show you your bunk.
Apache said, leading Tony to his bed.
Go ahead and get settled. Chow is in 30 minutes and we have a hike after that.
Tony sat on his bed, emptying his bag into a footlocker. The trunk already contained a week's worth of uniforms and toiletries. Everything fit perfectly, and his name, Stone, was labeled at the end of the bed. His space had been prepared in the few minutes it took him to arrive. This place is efficient, Tony mused as he closed his locker. The room's door opened once more, but Tony didn't look up, noticing instead the name Duke on the footlocker opposite him. Duke and Tony, only a year apart, were placed as partners due to their previous shared training. These partnerships were responsible for each other during training and missions. What these missions entailed, Tony didn't know, but he was glad to have Duke watching his back. This was the first time since losing Collin that he felt he could truly trust someone. The next year would be spent training like any other soldier, with one key difference. They had to prepare for the world they now inhabited and learn how to fight it. Once their superiors were convinced they could handle themselves in the field, a training exercise was implemented to test them. Pairs were sent beyond the walls with a specific task. Tony and Duke set off in the cold night, equipped with minimal gear and a rifle each. They watched other groups splinter off into different directions. Once alone on the snowy path, Duke started idle conversation. Tony answered as well as he could, his mind looping back to the last time he was outside the base. His eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. His predominant thought was of a potential attack, a vivid memory of the day Collin died, resurfacing.
You okay?
Yeah, just not sure if I'm ready for this.
Well, that's what we are out here to find out.
Duke replied, giving his partner a light nudge.
Maybe. Or maybe we are being fed to the wolves.
Tony sighed. They halted and crouched near their target location, remaining still under snow-covered foliage. Their eyes were fixed on a large moving truck in the distance. 3 men standing outside an old barn, smoking and chatting. Their mission was to retrieve that truck by any means necessary. Duke tapped Tony's shoulder, then pointed toward the western tree line. Tony nodded, and they stealthily moved from their hiding place toward the trees. The 2 boys kept low, moving from tree to tree, their camouflage and the darkness obscuring their movement until they were near. They paused at the edge of the trees, watching until the men returned inside the barn. Duke darted for the driver's door while Tony headed for the opposite side. They quietly opened the doors and gently shut them. Duke's hands explored the dash behind the steering wheel, finding the cold metal keys still in the ignition. He shot a questioning glance at Tony, asking silently if he was ready. Tony nodded again, and the truck rumbled to life. Only a few feet had the truck covered when the barn door burst open and the men started firing their rifles at the vehicle. The boys ducked instinctively to dodge a ricocheting bullet, and Duke slammed the pedal to the metal. Within minutes, they were out of sight and laughing about their successful escape. 2 miles down the road, Duke steered the truck into a small clearing in the woods. They needed to verify the truck's contents before heading home. Tony jumped down from the passenger seat and joined Duke at the back door. The metal protested with creaks and moans as the latch dropped and the door opened. Duke stumbled back for a moment, bumping into Tony as 4 teenagers emerged from the cargo area, rifles aimed at them. Tony's gaze fell in disappointment, and Duke merely shook his head in disbelief.
Looks like you boys failed,
Apache said, grinning.
Only because we got bad intel.
Yeah. Plus the 2 groups aren't supposed to be working together, just partners.
You think there are rules out there?
Weasel mocked.
I think I know where you got your name from now.
Tony shot back.
Watch it, kid.
Weasel retorted, earning a laugh from Tech.
Okay. All right.
Apache intervened.
Let's get back to the base before it gets too late. Wheeler, get this thing moving.
With a quick acknowledgement of his orders, one of the larger boys climbed into the driver's seat. Duke and Tony made to follow, but were told that their punishment for failing the mission was a 6-mile trek home. Duke glared at Apache, the thought of the hike in the snow igniting his fury. Tony tapped him on the shoulder and shook his head, signaling that arguing would be futile. The truck came to life again, and in no time, it was out of earshot. The two boys started their long, cold journey home, their eyes scanning the shadowy trees. After about an hour, Tony alerted Duke to something. He'd spotted the lights first, but as soon as Duke saw them, they both dropped into a crouch and crept towards the trees. The truck sat unmoving on the roadside, illuminated by its headlights. They observed for a few minutes, but saw no movement. If an opposing force had taken the truck, they would surely have moved it. The scene just didn't add up. Duke made a quiet sign for Tony to follow as he started moving toward the truck. Tony unshouldered his rifle, keeping his gaze fixed on the truck. Duke followed suit, readying himself for any possible threat ahead. The cab was empty, with no sign of their squad mates. Tony moved towards the still unlatched back door. One hand pushed it open, while the other aimed the rifle inside. Inside was empty too, but something caught his eye. A dark brown stain on the floor. Duke came around the passenger side to find Tony staring into the truck. It took a moment, but as soon as he spotted the stain, his hand clasped Tony's arm, pulling him back to the trees for cover. The two sat, listening to the wind rustling the canopy above. Laughter echoed faintly, and Duke turned to its source. Instinctively, they moved towards the sound, careful to avoid any twigs or brush that might betray their approach. The crackling of a fire became audible, as did the voices of 4 different men. The trees started to thin out, indicating they were approaching a clearing. The light from the fire was visible now, and the shadows of the men danced across the grass.
I really wish you hadn't killed the long-haired one.
A man's voice floated through the darkness.
He was pretty. I could have had some fun with him.
We'd still have that little girl if you weren't so rough with her.
Another voice echoed back.
Both of you shut up. You're giving me a headache.
A third voice chided.
You could be helping me clean this meat so we can eat.
At those words, Tony took a step back. Duke urged him forward. They both needed to see what lay ahead, even though they didn't want to. Ahead, a man was poking at the fire with a stick. Another was rummaging through packs on the ground. 2 others were standing over the shredded body of Apache. A wave of nausea hit Tony. He covered his mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. Duke signaled him to keep quiet. Their 3 friends were bound and gagged at the edge of the makeshift campsite. Beaten and bruised, fear in their eyes was palpable.
We've got to do something,
Tony whispered.
I know. Just give me a minute to think,
Duke replied, attempting to keep his voice low.
There are too many of them for us to handle, so we're going to have to split them up.
Let me go around, get their attention. You go get our friends.
No. If they catch you, then I'm alone,
Duke replied, shaking his head.
I'm going to try and pull the one by the bag out. Get your knife ready.
Creeping through the trees, Duke led the way with Tony close behind. They arrived at the back of a tree, near where the man was rummaging through a pile of bags. Tony positioned himself against the tree, drawing his combat knife from its sheath. He gave Duke a nod. In response, Duke picked up a rock and swiftly launched it at the man, hitting his leg. The man yelped in surprise, drawing a knife and cautiously approaching the tree. As he rounded it, Duke was standing 10 feet away in the forest, a sick smile spreading across the man's face. The man, now past the tree, began to lick his knife blade. He egged Duke on, laughing to himself. Suddenly, Tony sprang onto the man's back, a hand covering his mouth and the knife quickly sliding across his throat. Blood gushed from the wound, stifling the man's attempt to scream. The man began to struggle. Duke moved in and held him down, keeping the cries muffled until he finally stopped moving. Leaning against the tree, Tony stared down at his blood-covered knife and hands.
Okay, now we just have to split off another one,
Duke said, peeking around the tree. Tony didn't respond. Seeing his friend's stunned expression, Duke grabbed his shoulders.
You gotta stay with me, Stone. I can't take these guys on my own.
Tony was shaking, fear evident in his trembling body.
You did what you had to do. They killed Apache and they're going to kill all of us if you don't help me stop them.
The weight of the situation bore down on Tony. Yet he knew Duke was right. Sometimes you had to kill to stay alive. He began to move, weaving between trees as they circled the camp. Feeling like a wolf stalking its prey, he understood why they were called apex predators. They hunted the hunters.
Where the hell did Jeb go?
A man asked from the camp.
I don't know, Bill. He probably went to take a piss.
Well, he didn't take his gun, so go check on him.
The smallest man in the group, grumbling about having to chase after Jeb, stepped into the brush. He was carrying one of the rifles they had taken from one of the boys. As he moved away from the camp, he tripped over something solid. His rifle tumbled away as he landed with a thud, swearing in pain.
What happened, Rick?
Nothing. Just tripped over a root or something.
Rising slowly and dusting off his pants.
Well, get Jeb and get your ass back here.
Yeah.
Rick mumbled, continuing to wipe his pants. His hand came away wet, and when he examined it, the red tint was undeniable. His eyes widened as he turned to look at Jeb's body sprawled beside the tree. Before he could scream, 2 shots rang out from the campsite. Rick quickly picked up his rifle and rushed back towards the fire. There, he found the 2 remaining men lying in their own pools of blood, bullet holes in their skulls. He scanned the trees, seeing nothing, but when he turned back towards Jeb's body, he found Duke aiming at him.
Put the gun down,
Duke said.
Yeah, right, kid.
Rick lifted his gun in response.
Do what he says.
Tony's voice broke through the silence, the barrel of his AR-15 pressing against the man's head. They disarmed Rick and bound him with the same restraints that had once held their friends. 2 of the boys were instructed to create a gurney for Apache's body. Tony sent Wheeler to check if their truck was still at the road. Once everything was collected, along with their prisoner, they trudged back to the road and loaded Apache into the truck. The group remained silent, guns trained on Rick, who sat gagged in the back. Upon reaching the base, they unloaded quietly. Their instructor, upon seeing Apache's ravaged body, began to question the group. But before he could, Tony and Duke exited the truck, pushing their prisoner towards him. They silently indicated his crimes as they passed, their bodies tired, hurt, and coated in blood and dirt. All they wanted was to bury Apache. But their superiors had other plans. Apache's body was confiscated for evidence, and Rick was placed in a holding cell. The following day, the entire group was called to speak to General Foreman, one at a time. They were questioned about the events of the previous night and told not to repeat them to another soldier. Tony and Duke sat outside the office, waiting their turn, unsure of what they would be asked. Duke considered asking Tony if he was going to be all right, but the blank stare that still hung on the boy's face made him second-guess it. Tony sat emotionless, while Duke disappeared into the general's office. He sat thinking of the blood and of Apache's body. Then he thought about how it felt to kill again. It reminded him of Collin and how small it made him feel. His name being called broke him from his dream as Duke passed by without even looking at him.
Specialist Stone,
Foreman said as Tony took a seat.
I'm sure you know why you are here.
Yes, sir, I do.
The boy answered, staring at the wall behind the man.
What happened exactly?
Foreman asked, while scribbling notes and staring at his papers. Tony relayed the story for the general, his eyes not leaving the whitewashed wall, barely even blinking. The words told each step he had made and what he had witnessed. It played on repeat in his head as he spoke, his body shaking when he began detailing Apache's body. Then, when mentioned killing, he would look to his hands. They still felt dirty. In his mind, he could still see the blood staining it. When he was finished, he sat staring at his hands. The general finished writing and took notice. The room was quiet for some time, neither of them sure what to say at first.
How could this have happened?
We call them vultures. It's one of the things we are fighting against out there.
Foreman sighed.
How did they even know we would be out there?
Tony's eyes became wild and turned directly at the general. Foreman turned in his chair, stood and walked around the desk. He sat on the edge of it, and for a moment just looked at Tony. He shook his head, trying to decide what to say. There were a lot of things in this world that had changed, but he was still having trouble understanding it himself. When he was sure of the right words and how to say them, he gave another sigh and slid the folder across the desk. Tony looked down to see images of two men in apex predator uniforms, one of which looked familiar. He looked closer, and his eyes grew wide, remembering the man who was carving into Apache.
We've discovered that some of those vultures have found their way into our ranks,
Foreman said with a frown.
Wait, you mean...
Tony shook his head.
No, not in here too.
Not anymore. You took care of that.
Foreman rested his hand on Boy's shoulder. Tony pulled away.
How do you know there isn't more?
The general stood and went back to his seat, pulled the folder back to him and said,
That's why I asked you here, Stone.
It took the next year for their small unit to uncover the wolves among them, but with the general's help, they did. There had been 6 charged with molestation, 4 for rape, and 3 more groups killing their younger counterparts. They only found 1 more instance of cannibalism, but it was enough. With each mission, Tony became harder. He was becoming the wolf that stalked in the night, and his pack grew strong. At the end of that year, each member of their group was promoted to corporal, and B Company had been nicknamed the Night Stalkers. Where their individual strength was lacking, they made up for with teamwork. No one dared cross them in packs, and it was not long before they received their first mission outside their usual scouting grounds. They would be sent south, back across the border. Tony would be going back to Pembina, North Dakota, for the first time in over 2 years, and he immediately thought of a tiny inscription over a shallow grave. Like usual, the group set out at night. Buzzkill had been requested to drive them by jeep to the border, where they set out on foot. They moved quietly through the overgrown field, the brush higher than their crouched bodies. The moon overhead guided their movements as they approached a small farmhouse on the outskirts of Pembina. Tony recognized the place. He had passed it not long before being taken by the predators. His eyes scanned the field, especially further south. There stood the decrepit tree, a monument to his past. He tapped Duke on the shoulder and pointed to it, signaling to head that way. The group came to rest under the tree, several of the boys taking an opportunity to check their gear, grab a gulp of water, or check their map. Duke hovered over one of them, staring down at the map and asking questions of the designated target. Tony stood by the tree, running his fingers along Collin's name. It took a few minutes for Duke to notice, but he approached and placed a hand on Tony's shoulder.
You okay?
Duke asked, his brows curving in concern.
Yeah, just saying hello to an old friend.
Tony smiled slightly.
What?
The older of the two said, confused.
Remember I told you I had help getting all the way here?
Well, yeah, but that's about all you ever really told me.
This is where he died.
Tony waved his hands around to the clearing.
So, this is where I buried him.
Oh.
Duke shuffled his feet and looked down before coming closer, noticing the name in the tree.
Collin?
Yeah, he was like a brother to me. I wouldn't have made it here if it weren't for him.
Tony sighed, a tear forming at the edge of his eye.
Funny.
Duke laughed slightly.
Why's that?
Tony turned to look at him.
I had a brother named Collin,
Duke said while smiling, his eyes trailing off in a memory. Tony found himself staring at Duke, shocked by what he had heard. What were the odds? He stared harder, and soon Duke noticed. Duke squinted again, asking if his friend was okay. Tony simply knelt down and removed his pack. A small compartment on the side was opened, and Tony revealed a tattered old Bible. Between the pages, he found what he was looking for, a yellowed and worn picture of a family. There was a mother, father, and 2 very young boys. He tucked the Bible under his arm and stepped to Duke, handing him the picture. Duke's eyes narrowed as he attempted to see the image in the dark. But soon he realized what he was looking at. His thumb trailed over the young image of his mother and the smiling face of his father. He laughed slightly at seeing his chubby cheeks as a tiny boy, and when he saw Collin, The tears began to roll down his cheeks. Tony brushed a tear away as well and stepped back to the tree. He knelt there over Collin's grave, holding the Bible and looking at Duke.
How?
I have no idea. He thought you were dead.
Tony said in a quiet tone of remembrance.
So, he's buried here.
Tony nodded.
Yeah, he died protecting me, and I couldn't just leave him out here to be picked at by the animals. He wouldn't have done that to me.
Duke knelt by the makeshift grave, his hand touching the ground. Salty specks littered the dirt as they both sat quietly. The rest of the group had noticed the exchange but decided to stay out of it. Tony then leaned over, pushing the Bible toward Duke. He told him it had been Collin's, and he knew that his brother would want him to have it. Duke took the worn book from Tony, his fingers pressing it open and scanning through the pages. The ink was faded, but he could still read some of the scriptures. The front still had his brother's name written in it, and he remembered when his grandmother had gifted them both one. Duke's hands flipped to the back pages, which had been left blank for writing notes. He found a letter addressed to him in his brother's handwriting.
Danny, if I don't see you again and you're reading this, I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you better. I spent the last few months so sure you were dead. Then, I found Tony. He gave me hope to find you again. He has become like a brother to me. He reminds me so much of you. He could never replace you, but it made it easier out here without you. If you find him with this book, stay close to him. He can't replace me either, but I promise you, you won't regret meeting him. Take care of each other. Survive. And remember, I will always love you. Your big brother, Collin.
Duke tucked the Bible in his pack and gave Tony a hug. Their group turned away, and Weasel started asking about the mission to try to change the subject. Tony stepped away, patting Duke on the back. He nodded to him to say it would be all right, and promised they could talk more once the mission was done. Duke agreed, and they stepped back to the group. Weasel had pointed out the path they would take that led to the farmhouse ahead. It sat just on the edge of the property, and according to their sources, a group of murderous scavengers had taken up residence in it. According to General Foreman, this is where most of the vultures had come from recently. The radio keyed up. A message came through from Overwatch Group requesting position of the Night Stalkers. Tony touched at his ear before identifying himself and informing them of their position. They were asked for confirmation of go status. Tony looked to the group, who nodded in agreement. Tony gave the confirmation as they all readied their weapons. The group moved toward the farmhouse as a larger group waited on the hill behind the house. Overwatch was made up of a more experienced adult group, which had been instructed to observe and assist. This was their first sanctioned mission outside the wall and would determine their future within the apex predators. Tet observed from the back with binoculars, calling out targets appearing through the windows. There had been 2 armed men standing on the front porch, 3 inside that appeared to be drinking an unidentified motion within one of the upstairs windows. The group advanced. Duke took Wheeler to flank left, while Tony, Weasel, and Tech moved right. They approached from the tall grass, stopping just at the edge. The 2 men outside seemed to be having a discussion, which might take some time. They would not be able to enter through the front without being spotted.
It's not like it's going to matter anyway.
One of the men said.
What do you mean?
The other replied.
You know we're all going to be speaking Spanish soon?
That's just a rumor. The Mexicans aren't going to come all the way up here.
Either way, I'm going to have as much fun as I can before then.
Tony had no idea what they meant, but he made a note to ask the general when they returned. He looked across the field to Duke, who was signaling for him to take his group around back to find an entrance. He motioned with his hand a confirmation, then pointed to his right. The group followed behind him closely with their weapons at the ready. They moved in a staggered formation, slipping through the brush until they reached the backyard. The grass had not been kept cut, which allowed them to draw closer to the rear entrance. The steps were broken and the door appeared to be boarded shut. They would not be able to enter without making a lot of noise. Weasel tapped Tony on the shoulder and pointed to 2 large doors that led downward. They could only assume it led to some sort of cellar, which would be their best bet. Tech fished for his lock-picking set and started work on the fastened chain that held the doors closed. The boys eased the doors open, deafening the creak the old wood would make. They entered one at a time, descending into darkness. Their feet met concrete steps that dropped below floor level toward a dirt floor. Each flashlight attached to their rifles flickered to life, and they took the room in sweeping formation. The interior was only half that of the upper floors, surrounded by a cinder block foundation. Wooden shelves lined the room with glass jars of varying size. Weasel approached, his light refracting through the liquid inside. It revealed a fleshy mass that had once been a human foot, floating in some sort of preservative. Weasel's eyes widened once he realized what was in front of him. When Tony noticed this, he clasped his hand over the boy's mouth. Tony shook his head and raised a finger to his mouth. They could not afford to be heard before they knew what was waiting upstairs. Tony radioed the rest of the group to inform them that his group had made it inside. After receiving confirmation, the group continued to search the room for an entry into the home. Among the jars were various body parts, but what was most disturbing was the intact body of a fetus. Tony stared at this particular specimen for several minutes, unable to understand why anyone would do this. Tet's flashlight waved side to side to draw their attention to a ladder. The rungs ended at a hatch in the ceiling. Tony motioned for his squad mate to go up, then pointed to his eyes to give an order to look around. Tet slid his rifle over his shoulder and started to ascend. Once he reached the hatch, he gave it a slight push. To his surprise, it moved, so he reached into his pocket to reveal a small mirror. The hatch raised slightly, and with the mirror, he circled the space. It appeared to exit into a pantry full of more jars, so he finished opening the hatch. Once Tet gave the all clear, the other two joined him in the cramped pantry. Tony took the mirror and slid it under the edge of the pantry door. The other side held a kitchen with a large butcher block table in the center. The wood was still stained from the last use, which caused Tony's dinner to try to exit his throat. He held it back and swallowed, gagging at the taste. He relayed what he saw to prepare his group for what they would see next as he reached for the handle. Tony allowed the door to part just enough to see out and notice the hallway that led to the living room. The door swung open slowly, Tony's rifle rising as he exited. Weasel followed just behind, scanning the area to the rear of Tony. Tet was last, pushing the door back behind him and crossing the kitchen. Various cutting tools had been scattered across the kitchen counter, and the sink was still specked with blood and viscera. Tet covered his mouth and nose to try to block out the odor, but it was too powerful. The kitchen was tiny, and the back door was all that lay behind them. They had but one direction to go, and that was toward the living room. Each area was dimly lit with candles and oil lanterns, and the light danced along the walls. This only added to the sense of paranoia that grew in the young soldiers. They knew that at any corner they could be met with a fight. Tony held up his hand to signal the group to stop as he approached a doorway to his left. All of them could hear the men in the living room talking now, but they had to check each room as they passed. The leader's rifle made the corner of the door with Weasel just behind. It had once been a bedroom, but now resembled a torture chamber. The bed had been fitted with chains that currently held the lifeless body of a young woman. Tony checked her pulse to verify what his mind already knew to be true. He pulled the sheet over her cold and naked body. It was the best he could do for her now. They exited back into the hall and switched to the opposite wall in order to approach the next doorway. The passage was shut, so again Tony used the mirror to judge what may be on the other side. When he stood, he could only look back and shake his head. His hand grasped the knob carefully, turning it as slowly as possible. The light from the hall spilled into a tiny closet where another woman sat bound and gagged within. The woman's eyes grew wide and began shaking at the sight of the boys. Tony could only imagine she thought they were there to hurt her.
We are not here to hurt you. We're gonna get you out of here, okay?
The woman nodded as if she understood, tears filling her eyes as Tony helped her to her feet. He ordered Weasel to escort her back to the cellar and away from the house. Weasel took the woman by the hand and headed back to the pantry door. Tony whispered into his radio for assistance. Duke responded. Once he was aware of the situation, he took Weasel's place in the group. They stood silent in the hall, the The stairs leading up were to their left and the doorway to the living room was right ahead. They could not risk alerting the men in the living room, but had no idea what lay in store above them. Tony pointed to the living room and moved forward, then pointed to Duke before gesturing toward his eyes and back up to the stairs. Duke nodded and aimed his rifle to the staircase. He fell to the back of the group to watch their back. Tony's rifle passed into the living room first, with Tech's shoulder at his back. Once he could see the two men within, he noticed they were playing cards at a small folding table and drinking beer. Their angle made it easier for their entry without being noticed at first. But once both of the boys were in the room, it was hard to hide. The men had weapons near them, but Tony and Tech were locked on their position.
Get up slowly. Do not speak.
The two men rose slowly, their hands coming up and over their heads. Tony gestured toward the front door and the men began moving toward it. Tony tilted his head to key the radio in an attempt to inform Wheeler that two men would be exiting in a minute. As he did, the man in the rear dove for Tony's rifle, shoving it against the wall. The boy instinctively fired, but the bullet buried into wood. He felt the man's fist punch him in the face as his body was shoved back into Tech. Tech could not shoot without harming Tony, and simply stumbled back. By this time, Duke had turned his attention to his friends and attempted to get a clear shot. Tony struggled with his adversary as the other man ran for the shotgun that rested by the table. Feet bound down the stairs, questioning the noise. Duke turned to shoot, but was tackled to the ground by the man who had come down. One of the man's hands pressed the rifle into Duke's chest, while the other drove his knuckles into his face. Tony was finally able to bring his knee up and push back the one that held him. His rifle snapped into place, and 3 shots were fired before the man could regain his balance. As that one dropped, Tony turned to the next, who was about to fire the shotgun. The boy pulled the trigger while dropping backward into the hall. The door frame was splintered by 5.56 rounds and buckshot simultaneously as Tony hit the floor. Duke blocked the next few punches with the butt of his rifle and attempted to shove the man off of him, but it was no use. He was too large. The body of his rifle began to bury into his neck, cutting off his air until Tech turned and dropped the end of his gun into the man's temple. The large figure crumpled to the floor, holding his head and cursing. Tony looked back as the man attempted to get up and screamed for Tech to shoot. His friend simply stared with his gun trained on the person.
I said shoot, God damn it!
At the sound of gunfire and screaming, Wheeler and Weasel forced their way in the front door. Weasel popped a couple of rounds into the man in the living room, who was injured but trying to get up from the floor. The man's body dropped limp after one bullet pierced his skull. Wheeler shoved Tech aside and fired 3 rounds at the final adversary, 2 hitting him in the chest and 1 in the neck. Blood sprayed across the hall and created a peppered painting on the wall.
Are you guys all right?
Weasel asked.
We're fine,
Tony said while gasping for air.
You get the girl out?
Yes, sir. She's with Overwatch.
Wheeler replied.
Good. Let's finish sweeping this house and get the hell out of here.
Duke nodded while adjusting his gear again, preparing to ascend the steps. They fell in line behind him, Tony taking up the rear. If there was anyone else inside, they would have to face all of them. When they reached the top step, they were greeted by several young children. They stood whimpering in doorways of bedrooms and staring at the stairway. The boys approached slowly, asking if there were any other adults inside. Some shook their head and others simply stared blankly while the group searched each room. After a short interview of some of the oldest children, the group learned that each one had been abducted, along with their parents, and had not seen either of them for weeks.
Night Stalker 1 to Overwatch.
Tony spoke into his radio transmitter.
This is Overwatch. Go ahead, Night Stalker 1.
Mission complete. We have 12 civilian miners that will need extraction.
10-4 Night Stalker 1. Extraction en route in 15.
The ride back to base was a quiet one. The group was bruised, but not nearly as bad as the children they accompanied. Tony had felt bad about their near failure, but when he saw how much worse his life could have been, he let the feeling fade. This was the world he was part of now, and at least he was on the right side of it. The children hugged each other and questioned their destination. Some of the other Night Stalkers attempted to explain the base, but Duke suggested they limit their information until they could speak to the general. Tony let their words fade away as he stared at the farmhouse ablaze. They had burned all evidence of the carnage in hopes to deter anyone else from repeating it. He had seen so much death in such a short period of time. His body felt numb as the light danced in the distance. Everything continued to burn, even though the fall was over. He wondered if this was what life would be from here on out. Death and destruction. He used to like fire, the beauty of it, but that was when it was for roasting marshmallows. His hands gripped his rifle a little tighter in anger, as he was reminded of another thing he may never do again. Once again, Tony found himself sitting in Foreman's office for debriefing. The small glimmer of light was gone from his eyes now. It faded in the distance with that burning farmhouse. The general spoke, but the sound was muffled by Tony's thoughts. He answered robotically, giving any pertinent information. When the meeting came to a close, Foreman asked if the boy would be all right. Tony simply nodded and stood from his seat. He headed for the door, but just as he reached for the knob, he remembered something.
A question, sir?
Tony turned back to the general.
Go ahead, Stone.
Is there an army marching on North America?
The general paused and closed the file he'd been scribbling in.
Yes.
He sighed.
That's why you need the kids, right?
Foreman rubbed at his eyes.
We need everyone we can find. We're severely outnumbered.
Tony opened the door.
Then I should get back to my men. We have training to do.
When Tony entered the barracks, the rest of his group were breaking down their gear and preparing to head to bed. He stood in the doorway, watching each of them, their faces showing defeat. He knew that if a few locals almost took them down, there was no way these boys could survive war. This could not be the end, he thought. He had just found Collin's brother and friends. Tony stood silently watching each of them move about the room and imagined their death. This world had too much of that already.
Stop unpacking.
Tony finally spoke. Duke looked up.
We're not going back out, are we?
Tony nodded and listened as the group groaned in unison.
We are leaving.
He drew them in close and told them about the conversation he had overheard during their mission and Foreman's confirmation of the rumor. Each of them listened intently, and Tony could see the fear in their eyes. None of them were older than 17 and knew they were not prepared to face battle-hardened soldiers. Tony urged them to pack as much supplies as possible over the next 24 hours and to meet at the motor pool at sunset. They would commandeer a vehicle and leave this place. The apex predators would have to fight this war without them. Tony had made a promise to survive, and he would protect his new family, especially Duke. The following day was spent gathering food, weapons, and ammunition. They were not sure how long they would be on the road, but several packs were prepped for their last mission. Wheeler had acquired the key to the motor pool under the pretense of gassing up one of the Humvees. Weasel distracted Packrat long enough for Wheeler to gather the items they would need. Tech had always helped in the kitchen, so it was not odd when he requested access to the pantry. One by one, they acquired the supplies they would need, and by the time the sun had fallen, they had all met at the motor pool. Duke and Tech loaded gear into a Humvee as Tony and Weasel plotted a course. The weather north was too harsh, and there would be enemy forces to the south. They had to be careful, no matter their choice, but it had to be made now. Wheeler climbed into the driver's seat as the rest took their places inside. Tony climbed into the passenger seat and pointed at a destination on the northeast coast as the vehicle roared to life. The group approached the gate where a guard questioned their actions. Tony leaned over and gave an excuse of having a secret mission. The guard was not convinced and radioed for confirmation. Tony simply nodded and Wheeler hit the gas, barreling through the barricade and into the night, gunfire peppering the vehicle in their retreat. Duke leaned forward.
So, what's the plan?
We're going to get as far away from here as possible and hopefully stay alive.
Duke leaned back and the vehicle fell quiet. None of them were sure where to go or how they would be able to sustain themselves in this world. The apex predators would surely be looking for them, and they would have to avoid the army that was taking control of North America. All of this only made surviving more difficult, but they had each other, and that would have to be enough. As they passed the remains of the old farmhouse, their eyes fell on the smoldering wreckage. Smoke still tainted the air above it, and they wondered if that could be their future. Headlights of 3 vehicles topped a hill behind them, and they instantly knew it would be the predators. Their vehicle began receiving bullets within seconds, and each of them ducked to avoid any ricochet. Wheeler forced the accelerator down further until it touched the floor. He struggled to remain on the road as their pursuers drew closer. Weasel grabbed his rifle and leaned from the window, returning fire. Tony screamed for him to get inside, but it was too late. The boy was shot 4 times in the chest. The rifle tumbled from the vehicle, and his body fell limp in the seat, his head still hanging out the window.
No one else tried to be a hero.
Tony yelled as Tech scrambled to cover Weasel's wounds.
It's too late. He's gone, man,
Duke said as he pulled at Tech's arm.
They're gaining on us,
Wheeler said. Tony looked back, and the lead vehicle was only 2 car lengths away. They would overtake them and more than likely kill them. He had to do something, and fast, so he told Wheeler to head for the trees. The wheels kicked up dirt as they rapidly changed direction. The boys were tossed about inside as they bounded over a hill and into the woods. The 2 Humvees behind them followed after and weaved between trees. Wheeler struggled to avoid each one as well, but sideswiped a large oak, causing him to lose control. The wheels caught at an awkward angle and turned the vehicle on its side. The world went dark for a moment, and when Tony opened his eyes, he could have sworn he saw Collin kneeling over him. He smiled slightly, and Collin did the same. He could hear talking around him, but he simply looked back to his old friend. Tony began to apologize, but Collin simply shook his head. The figure mouthed the words, "You're not done yet," before disappearing. Tony was forced back to reality by the sound of Tech screaming for help. General Foreman had him by the hair and was dragging him toward one of the other vehicles. Duke struggled to remove himself from the overturned Humvee, and it appeared that Wheeler had been killed during the crash. Tony slowly rose from the ground, his eyes searching the area. Duke was almost free from the vehicle, and Foreman had returned to claim another one of the boys. The other Humvee had turned back once they noticed the crash. They would need equipment to retrieve the vehicle, and Foreman was sure he could handle a couple of kids. Tony grit his teeth and began walking toward the general, despite the pain he now felt in his knee. His hand reached down and grasped a grenade, pulling the pin. He shoved it out in front of him, so Foreman could clearly see it.
Step away from that Humvee. We are taking it and we are getting out of here.
Foreman paused and held up his hands.
Now hold on. Don't do anything stupid.
No talking. You get away from the vehicle now or we all die.
The general laughed.
You can't be serious, kid.
Dead serious. We are leaving and you are not going to follow us. We don't want to be pawns in your war. We are not soldiers. We are kids. And we are going to live.
Foreman slowly backed away as Duke grabbed a few bags from the crashed vehicle. The 2 boys joined Tech in the general's vehicle, and Duke took the driver's seat. Tony eased himself into the passenger seat, still holding the live grenade. As they rolled past the crash, Tony tossed the explosive into the crashed Humvee. Foreman dove behind a tree as the 3 boys drove away. The sound of the explosion echoed through the trees as they exited the woods. They never looked back as they headed east and toward anything better than the life they'd come to know. Well, my friends, we've reached the end of tonight's chilling tale, After the Fall, the complete story. Parts 1 through 10 by the talented Locked 334. I hope you've enjoyed our descent into darkness and that you'll carry a piece of the Fear File Chronicles with you as you drift into uneasy dreams. If our story left you shivering and shaking, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who crave a good scare, and subscribe to the Fear File Chronicles for more haunting horrors. Remember to hit the bell notification so you're always among the first to know when a new nightmare awaits. As always, we appreciate your support and would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sharing your fears and frights with us truly means a lot, So don't be shy to engage with our sinister community. Until next time, remember to embrace the darkness, for it is within the shadows that our most terrifying stories are born. Good night and stay scared.